Please work.
Hello, hello, is this on?
No.
I think it's on, okay. Hi, hello, good morning. Welcome to the 2024 State Contract Seminar to Infinity and Beyond, Beyond the Basics. We've got a full presentation for everybody, full of good information, so we wanted to go ahead and get started. Up first, from the Indiana Department of Administration,
Why does
Aaron
it look like
Kellum,
that?
Tammy Glickman. Thank you.
Where's my applause? Come on. Thank you. Like I'm here at 8:30. I moved over the weekend. Every part of my body hurts and I'm exhausted. So thank you for the applause. Obviously, I'm a little bit needy. All right. Good morning. As he said, I am Aaron Kellum. I'm Deputy Commissioner for Procurement with IDOA. And why do you care? I'm going to tell you. We've got a mission, as all state agencies do. Mostly what we want to do is support your agency's mission and make sure tax dollars are spent properly.
Let's see if I can get my headphones to work.
There's more than just procurement in IDOA. So there's some of the other things that our agency is charged with. Property management, the 2 ombudsmen's, fleet, travel, procurement, and public works. That's a lot. I know a tiny bit about the other ones. Procurement's my jam, so that's where I'll stick. We've got a lot of training. It can seem overwhelming, so please reach out to us if you're confused, if you're not sure what's going on. That's why we do these trainings this year with the contracts training as well. There are things online, CBTs, and they are in small chunks. So don't think that you have to set aside a week. You can just
going to my
take a little
headphones.
chunk here and there as you familiarize yourself with the terms and the policies and the statutes. We don't just make this stuff up. It is founded in our authority and state statutes and procurement policy. This is a question we really do get a lot. Can I just purchase whatever my agency needs? No, but eventually. So the answer of eventually is, let us work through the process with you, and we will get you to what your agency needs and wants. It may not be what you thought at the beginning, but at the end, you'll be a true believer. So just keep in mind that no state agency has the authority to purchase anything. You guys get money, so you've got dollars, but you don't have the legal authority to purchase it till you come through my shop. We have delegated a certain amount of spend back to the agencies because I've got an awesome team, but I don't have an army of hundreds. So we have the DPAP training to help make sure that the head procurement agents at the state agencies are well-versed in the state policies and laws. So anything that is delegated back to the agency, it's your head proc. That's the one that's in charge. They know the rules. If they are happy, then we'll be happy and you can buy what your agency needs. Those are the big main procurement methods: competitive bidding, negotiated bidding, requests for proposals, RFPs, and then special procurements. See, we put the Indiana code up there just to remind you that we don't make this stuff up. It is found in the Indiana code. And what you need to remember about those particular areas is we're focusing on being clear and transparent. We wanted to make sure the vendor community understands what we want and how we're going to score them so that they can answer the needs of the agencies. As long as we stick with that, there's always going to be a quote unquote loser. As long as we stick with that, then we're sound. Request for proposal. Again, that's the big one that you will see. It's typically over $75,000. Please make sure that you budget plenty of time. Everybody is always pretty astounded when we say it can take sometimes 9 months, sometimes it's a year. A big chunk of that is, as you see down at the bottom, I don't have my laser pointer, and if I had one, I probably couldn't use it, on the street, 8 to 12 weeks. I know that sounds like a long time, but the vendor community is not just sitting around waiting for our RFPs. They don't get paid for that. That is a lot of effort and resources they put into something that may not ever actually pay their company a dime. So we want to take time to be thoughtful when we prepare the solicitation documents to make sure we're clear on what we need kind of what the problem is we're trying to solve, how we're going to score it, all of those kinds of things. Typically, there will be jargon in it, but what we want is if I were to read it, it would make sense to me. I would understand what you're looking for. And I'm not an expert in any of your guys' programs or any of the systems that you need. So there is a fine balance between being clear about the level of sophistication that you need from the responses and the solution that you're seeking from the vendor community, but also making sure it's very clear to the vendor community what you're looking for. And scheduling is a nightmare. I mean, you guys know how far in advance we sent the save the date for this, like we're getting married. And it's just a couple hour meeting. So that the process can take a long time because when we have evaluators and advisors, those comes from the agencies, you guys all have full-time jobs anyway, before we've asked you to do this. So it takes a while to get calendars synced so that we can have meetings, so you guys can have time to read the RFP responses, because it can be a lot to digest. We do have the opportunity to go back and forth with the vendor community for clarifications. If there's something that doesn't make sense or we think they're saying this, but we're not sure, because even the most well-written solicitation document can leave some ambiguity that probably needs to be fleshed out during the RFP solicitation process. We also strongly encourage vendor presentations. The responses are great, but they're flat. So when you can actually see the vendor come in and it's a little more of a back and forth, I think that most agencies would agree with you that was time well spent. And again, all of that takes time because everybody's got full-time jobs. And if you try and shortcut it, I promise you, anybody on my team can give you countless examples of you shortcut it and then you get crappy responses and you end up spending all this time on clarification questions that at the end of the day, that doesn't get you anywhere. All right, special procurements. This is some agencies' most favorite one. So we need to spend a little bit of time on this one because it's not a shortcut. It's not when you go, I don't want to do an RFP. I don't want to deal with Erin and her team. I'm going to do a special procurement. We are very fortunate in the state that we even have this as an option. I talked to my counterparts in other states and believe me, they are envious because when they've got something that fits one of these criteria, they're out of luck. I mean, they don't have a legal mechanism to do something other than a competitive process. It's been under fire before when those folks are over at the domed building. It's been on the chopping block a couple times. And there's been a lot of meetings and discussions and opportunities to educate some of the lawmakers on the idea that it's not just we go out and buy whatever we want. That's not how we use this. So in order to preserve the integrity of this law and our process, my team is tough on this. And that's because I'm breathing down their neck too. It's gotta tell the story. There are specific criteria that's set out in state statute that allows you to do this. 52210 is where you start. And the agencies often do have all the relevant facts to support a special procurement request under 52210, but they don't tell us that. They're trying to shortcut it. Believe me, we don't mind reading a lot. We read RFPs all day long and they're a lot. So if you give us a couple pages on an ESPR, I promise you, we can handle it. So don't shortcut the facts. Walk us through how you got to where you are and why you're going this route rather than a competitive process. Back in the olden days, prior to 2020, we had to do all this via email and it was a nightmare. So we now have it in PeopleSoft. It is a function through Forms, which is a free, if anything is free in PeopleSoft, but it's a delivered function that an incredible member of my team created. So it's got a little bit of quirks, but it works so much better. So we can insert anybody else that needs to approve it. So remember, it's not just my team. If there's anything IoT related, it's got to go to IoT. It could also then, after IoT reviews it, it may need to go to MPH. So make sure that you're keeping all those audiences in mind so that you can really, again, tell the story so each of those approving entities understands what you're doing and why. There's the guide. It is really very easy to follow. I can do it, so I assure you if I can, you can, because I'm not well-versed in PeopleSoft. As Tammy wanted me to include in red, and I agree, make sure when you're talking about the contract term, be specific. Do you anticipate extensions? My team needs to know that as well, because that does factor into the procurement method. Let me give you an example. Make sure I don't have, okay, I don't have one there. One of the common ones is purchasing method impairs the function of the agency. So essentially what you're saying is we have to move forward with this project, this purchase, this contract, whatever it is. Otherwise, a core function of the agency will cease to exist. And I don't have time to do one of your competitive processes. We get it, that happens. Sometimes you get federal funding and it's got an expiration window and you don't have enough time to get all the way through it. Okay, let me take you over here for a second. Federal funding, don't care. Still have to have a valid procurement method. Don't care, don't care, don't care. Everybody hear me? Don't care. The funding source makes no difference. You still have to follow state law. Tell us that in the story. Again, if you have a finite period of time to spend that money, tell us it's federal funds. There's these parameters that we have to be under contract by X number of days. That does happen, and that can be a valid use of that special procurement. But if it's regular old funding, we're going to give you like a year or two because you need to fill the gap. In that year or two, where the purchasing method would impair the function of your agency, start doing a different purchasing method. We want to see an electronic letter of intent telling us you're about to start an RFP. If you're not going to do that, we're not just going to do that in just endless iterations. Because again, we've got to protect the integrity of this law. Any special procurement, if I get taken over to the domed building and they want me to testify, I want to be able to very strongly and clearly spell out for them, here's why this was valid. And I shouldn't have to call the agency and have a bunch of meetings and learn all about it. I should be able to read the ESPR and it be very clear. So help me out, please. As I tell my team all the time, a lot of this really is about me. So if you could help me out, I'd appreciate it. All right, there's what an ESPR form looks like. This is how PeopleSoft looks. These are the items that we can query. It's also extremely hard to change this. So we just need you to work with it. Where we have some flexibility, okay, there we go. There's contract term. Again, be specific on that so that when my team is approving it, we understand the length of time that we're approving it. And again, when the resulting contract goes over to Tammy, she understands that procurement has said X number of years and that number of years matches what's on the contract. If it's not, she's going to have to stop. She's going to have to ask you, and it's going to delay everything. And all your work will not have gotten you what you needed. Here's the approvals. Again, we insert those, so you don't have to worry about that. But do keep in mind, it's more than just IDOA that's reviewing these. Supplemental justification. This is the document that we do have the ability to tweak and change because it's outside PeopleSoft. It's an attachment. Please make sure, I know those boxes are teeny tiny, but if you've ever worked with it, it expands. So you can include as much stuff as you want. Again, tell us the story, help us understand why a competitive purchase is not what's best for the agency. Because again, we're procurement. That's job security for us. So we are always coming at any situation that there should be a competitive process. And if you're coming at us with one of these, then your position is the facts are present to support something different. Help us make sense of that. And that does often, we got to know that you talked to somebody else, you did some sort of market research, some sort of justification that the price is correct. Vendors can smell it when they know you're under the deadline and they're not coming at you with their best price. So you don't show them all your cards. Do a little negotiation. Their first offer is never the best one. So that can be part of the story you tell us as well. They said it was going to be $1 million and we said no. And then we got it down to 800,000. Great, awesome. There was something done there to help save taxpayer dollars. That's part of this consideration too. So give us that information. All right, the other part that dovetails into the procurement is Division of Supplier Diversity. That's a different code section than what my team works with. So I know a little bit about it, and that's why I'm up here chatting about it. But their core functions are certification of the entities within the state of Indiana that meet the statutory criteria. So you can be certified as a woman-owned business, minority-owned business, or veteran-owned business. Minority and women, that's the criteria is the same. Veteran-owned is a little bit different. It's a different set of statutes that establish that, but it's all housed within DSD. They also check contract compliance. So if you have a contract that has participation in it, excuse me, understand that is a legally binding contractual requirement. We talk about goals, which I'll get to in a second. Goals are separate. Once it becomes words in a contract, it is just as binding on the vendor as everything else. So you as the agency that's managing that relationship are also then responsible for managing those that part of the relationship with the prime. Check in with them. Are they using their subcontractors? How is all of that going? That's a perfectly valid question, and we need you to do that because DSD is not a huge army of people. They can't check every single contract, but if the vendor community knows we're going to hold them to that, it just makes everything smoother all the way down the line. And the other caveat that I want you guys to always keep in mind is if there's been a competitive process, we have factored in the vendor's commitment to use a DSD certified vendor as part of the score. They got points for it or they didn't. If they didn't, then there won't be any participation on your contract likely, so don't worry about it. But if they did, that will be a part of the award letter. It will be a part of the contract. And oftentimes, because we have such close solicitations, the participation can make the difference. So this vendor, think of it this way, this vendor got the business because they made these commitments. And if you don't hold them to these commitments, then they just kind of lied and we let them get away with it. And nobody wants that. So you've got to stick with those. And they also have business outreach. I mean, they are constantly out going into the community and talking about the program and helping entities get certified. There's the goals that I mentioned. Those are based on a required diversity study that happens every year, every 5 years. I won't get into all that, but there's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of justification to indicate that these percentages support a disparity, which means there are sufficient businesses in the community that could meet the state's needs in certain areas. So they don't just survey and determine how many minority women or veteran-owned businesses there are in the state. They look at how many are in each area that the state of Indiana actually needs, actually procures. So we're trying to fill a gap there. Those are the percentages that the respondents need to meet or exceed in order to get the maximum amount of points for our solicitation. And again, once they've made those commitments and they are the selected vendor, it goes into the contract. It's a legally binding contract, legally binding part of their contract. Again, contractor compliance, one of the things that the primes are supposed to do is provide copies of the subcontractor contracts that they have entered into. Those are supposed to go to DSD. I tell state agencies, I think it's a good idea if you guys get a copy of them too. The state is not a party to that contract, so we're not the boss of that relationship, but there's no reason why you can't ask for a copy of the contract because those are subcontractors that are going to be doing work on your project. The prime is ultimately responsible. So if the sub is doing some work and it's not working out the way that you want, you go to the prime. You only go to the prime. You don't go to the sub. But as a part of good contract management, I 100% recommend that you, as the state agency, understand what those subs are going to do. And again, through the solicitation process, we do vet that. So the vendor can't offer a certified vendor to do something on the project that's not helpful. It's there must be a valuable scope contribution. So a good example, I think that's easy for people to understand is we had a state agency that was getting a new system. It was going to be a case management system. And one of the respondents had a certified vendor that was going to do PR and marketing for them. And their pitch was, it's really important to sell this new system in the community that's going to be using it. And so, here's X number of dollars that we've allocated and we'll handle this part for you. Hey, thanks guys. We didn't ask for that. We will do our own messaging. So that's not a valuable scope contribution. That doesn't count. And they got no points for that offering. I mean, I guess yay for creativity, but again, we need them to give us what we've asked for, not get so outside the box like that. So they got no points for that. Amendments and change orders, this often trips people up, but what you need to keep in mind is if the commitment was contemplated in a competitive solicitation, the expectation is that commitment will continue through the extensions. That's how our solicitations are written. So if a vendor is proposing a certified vendor for implementation only, and we've anticipated this will be maybe a 4 or 6 year contract, most implementations don't take that long. So the vendors need to have figured out and contemplated some other way for that certified vendor to be utilized in order to meet their percentage commitments. If something happens, because relationships change, maybe subcontractor's gotten bigger, doesn't do this line of work anymore, or it just hasn't meshed with the prime the way they'd hoped. Again, that happens. The state, you agency are not the referee of that. Get DSD involved. Get DSD compliance involved. If you're going to make changes, that has to be with their blessing. And we want you as the state agency to be aware of that, but it's not appropriate for you to be the champion for the prime. For you to say, well, the prime needs to save some money, and so the only way they can do that is by dumping the sub. Believe me, that happens. Those conversations happen more often than I would care to admit. That's not your role as the agency. You manage your relationship with the prime. The prime's responsibility is to manage the budget and their subs. And if they've gone awry, that is not your role. You send them to DSD. DSD will talk to the prime and the sub and figure out what can happen. But before any amendments hit Tammy's desk, if you're changing the subcontractor commitment, there needs to be in the supplemental document, email documentation from DSD. And not just, hey, we approve this change. Because the agency will send that multiple times. And that only counts for that one situation. So they can't just use it as a blanket anytime they want to make a change. So DSD is specific. We agree in this situation, this percentage with this vendor should change to this and this and this. So make sure you include that as a supplemental document so Tammy knows what happened and why. And most importantly, it's not so that she can judge whether it was appropriate, just documents that DSD has been involved and that everything is the way it should be. There's a couple templates out there for you guys to keep in mind. Always use the template on the IDOA website. Things change, and that's the only way you can make sure that you've got the most current one. Public Works has got some stuff out there. Again, I don't know a lot about Public Works, but go there. Leases, same thing. There's forms and manuals. The state leases a lot of property, and there are certain things that have to be in leases and certain things that absolutely cannot be in leases. So make sure that you go there and are using the proper things. Same thing with fleet. The car auto industry has just been a hot mess for the past couple of years. If you've tried to buy a car, the states were not immune from that, but things are starting to calm back down again. But this whole time we've still had the same state rules. Director of Fleet needs to be involved. There has to be that oversight to make sure that we are having a cohesive plan for what it is, what kind of vehicles the state is purchasing, and that we're doing the best to meet the state's needs for those vehicles. Travel, travel, travel. That's my team as well. We are now fully electronic for travel authorizations and reimbursements. Woot woot. So you get paid faster. And anybody and their brother in your agency that needs to review and authorize that travel, you guys set that up. Maybe not you sitting in this room, but the powers that be in your agency. So if it takes too long to get a travel authorization, look within, because that means it's going through 86 people at your agency, because my team's fast. All right, by the numbers, this is you, right, Tammy? All right, thank you. Clap for Tammy.
Hi, good morning. I'm going to try to use this microphone here, move around a little bit. Sorry about that. Can everybody hear me okay with the microphone? Great. As Aaron said, my name is Tamara Glickman. My friends call me Tammy, Deputy General Counsel at the Indiana Department of Administration, as Aaron, of course, already said. And I work with John Sneathen, who is the General Counsel, and Miss Sandra Redding. And together, the three of us are the legal division at IDOA. One of our roles is to review and approve every single state contract that comes through for execution, every contract, every addendum, every grant, every amendment, every grant amendment. That's just one of our roles, but it's a very important one. And although there are a lot of other elements that come into play with contracting, is that better? Oh, my goodness. There we go. Is that better? Thank you. Sorry about that. So I'm going to focus on negotiations, because if many of you are like me, I get a little nervous. I might feel outgunned. I'm still nervous about it, and you may be too. So let's first talk about the definition of negotiation. identifies some negotiation styles. We've got the adversarial negotiation and the collaborative negotiation that's identified in Black's Law. I'm sure many of you in the course of your time at the state, or perhaps in a previous employment, or perhaps in your private life, buying a car, buying furniture, or negotiating anything else, have come across both of these styles of negotiation. As we talk about it this morning, my wish for you, or my challenge to you, is that you come away and you are empowered, that you be empowered, be prepared, and be successful. What do I mean when I say be empowered? Many times when you approach a negotiation, as I said, you might feel outgunned. The other side's a big entity, or perhaps it's a small entity, or perhaps this is your first negotiation, or perhaps it was a contested RFP and there was a lot of back and forth. But you have a strong foundation. Come into that negotiation with the confidence that you have the training that Aaron talked about. You've been trained in procurement. You've been trained, you know, the DPAP manual, you know, the knowledge of the state, you understand the contract terms, and you have the support of all the other approving agencies. We've got your back. You're part of our team. We want your contract to be successful and your relationship with this vendor to be strong. And remember that you work for the state of Indiana. Sometimes because we do this all the time, or whether you've been here 1 year or many years with the state of Indiana, we just look at it as, you know, just another job. But it's not just another job. You're a very important part of the entire operation of state government. Don't forget that. So as you step into your negotiation, put on your superhero cape and move into that negotiation feeling strong and confident. How do you feel strong and confident? You're prepared. And as Aaron talked about, one of the best ways to be prepared is to have a full knowledge and understanding of your procurement method. That is the foundation for everything. If you are not knowledgeable about the procurement method, you come in with perhaps one hand tied behind your back because you don't understand what has taken place before you present the contract terms to this contractor. So know what happened. And think about what is your goal for this negotiation. And the timeline, that's really important, as all of you already know. What time does your client, your agency need for this vendor to be working? What we don't want to see, and I know it happens, is that your contractor starts working as you're negotiating your contract. I submit to you, you've already given up your power. Take your cape off, because you've given it back to the contractor, because they're already working for you and you're already bound to what they're doing on your behalf. So set your timeline up, anticipate what the contractor's questions are going to be. Where are they going to be concerned in the boilerplate? Are they going to be concerned about the timeline? We'll also have a team. Most of you are part of a larger contract team at your agencies. Perhaps you're negotiating on behalf of the program area, and your legal team will need to look at it. And other people in your agency will need to look at this and weigh in on some of these contract terms during your negotiation. Set up a timeline and respect the timeline and hold people accountable so that you can keep your negotiation on track. Finally, you need to think about, way up here in the beginning, when you're doing your procurement, your plan B. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But the plan B is what you're thinking about during your procurement, as a matter of fact. So finally, be successful. When you start out with a strong foundation, you will be successful. You've already shown that you're competent and confident and have exceeded expectations in the contracting world. We approve thousands of contracts and terminate a lot of contracts too, but not as many as we're executing every week. So don't give away your negotiating power. As Aaron said, don't show all your cards up front. One way that I've seen some agencies give away some of their power, when they engage with a contractor, they say to the contractor, well, I'm gonna seek a special procurement with this one, and I need a letter from you that you're the sole provider of this service. Oh my goodness, you've just given them the ability to understand you have nowhere else to go. This is the only contractor you want to enter into, and they hold all the cards now. As Aaron said, they can set the price. You just gave away your ability to say, hey, I don't want to do business with you. So you don't really need to share your special procurement or your special procurement justification with your contractor. The competitive process, as Aaron said, is the number one best way to get the best price and the best deal for the state of Indiana and your agency. So when you utilize that tool, you have the knowledge to get to plan B. So keep in mind, you want to be responsive. If you want the contractor to be responsive to you, you need to be responsive as well. Let people know you're working on it. Another department of your agency is looking at that contract. And avoid indecision. The indecision in the contract process as you're going through the boilerplate, or perhaps a statement of work, or any other of the elements that you're negotiating with your contractor, make a decision. If you are not comfortable with what they've proposed as a revision, say so. If there are parts of the terms that they've put forth that are not what your team asked for, say that. Be open and be honest. Keep in mind that if you remain silent on things, the contractor is assuming you accept them. And don't get caught in an endless circle of red lines. When you've agreed to terms and your contractor has said nothing about clauses 1 through 10 in your contract, those are accepted. They don't get to send it for a 4th round and start inserting reasonable in random places through 1 through 10 that were never there before, while you're trying to hammer out a limitation of liability clause. That's just a hard no. We've already agreed to 1 through 10. Don't throw this into disarray. So be firm, but be respectful with your contractors. So I want to tell each and every one of you that you have a superpower, and your superpower at the state of Indiana with the state's buying power is that there are more fish in the sea. This is not the only vendor that can service the needs of your agency. It might sound that way. It might look that way. You might love this vendor. They might be sitting next to you for the last 10 years of your tenure at the state. But this is 2024 and technology is exploding. I don't remember Salesforce from 20 years ago, but now they rule the world. Amazon started out as a book distribution company. They're the other half of ruling the world. So who's the next vendor that's going to be awesome and the cloud-based provider that we all want? I don't know who they are now, but if we look and if we solicit and if we follow the procurement laws, we'll know those things. We'll know that I brought in 3 bids and yours was the lowest or your services were higher. But when negotiation gets down to the end and you can't agree, you've reached an impasse and it happens. What do? You go to your plan B. Plan B is your exit plan. And as the screen shows, you walk away. Think about when you're at a car dealership and they've got you over the barrel for $5,000 more than you can afford. You walk away. You go to another car dealer. In this instance, in state procurement, you need to have thought this out beforehand. This is not a knee-jerk decision you make in the heat of the moment when you're angry and they want you to give up every single thing that is vital to your agency. This is something you've discussed in the beginning with your procurement. If it's an RFP, there were other vendors there that you can go to that are waiting and hoping that negotiations fall through with the vendor that was chosen, and they'll be there. And if it's happening, I suggest, and especially if it's an RFP and things begin to collapse, I recommend reaching out to IDOA and start thinking about what is your exit plan. How many people in the audience today have walked away from a negotiation, state contracting? That's excellent. That's empowering. And your contractors remember that. And when you say no, they understand you mean it. And I want to tell you that this isn't a tool. This isn't a game or a ploy that you use to get them agree to, let's say, the termination for convenience clause or limitation of liability or something in indemnification. This isn't a game. This is a no. I mean no. And if we can't agree on this, then thank you for your time. Be very respectful. Identify in writing why information, your terms you couldn't agree on, whatever it was, and then walk away and move on to your next contractor. In my experience, and maybe those who've raised their hand, the vendor, after it moves up the chain of command at that entity, the president starts calling, probably Aaron Kellum. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. That person didn't have the ability to make those bad decisions. We're not walking it back, because as soon as you walk it back, you lose the respect of that contractor. Thank you. We've had it in writing. You've had 4 months, 6 months, 1 year in my experience. You've had 1 year to work on these terms. We need to move forward. We're the state of Indiana. So use this. It's powerful. And the contractors will remember and they will respect your word in the future. They're not going anywhere. Those contractors and new contractors are coming up. Here's a couple things to consider. I don't have a lot of time to go over it, but keep in mind, as I said, you've got your superhero cape on. You have the ability to make modifications to these clauses. Some you can't. The AG is going to talk about that, but you have the ability to make a risk determination at your agency. But remember that if you make a concession on a contract term, it is possible that you are setting a precedent, not only with this vendor, but similar vendors. And if you've made it here, they'll expect you to make that concession each and every time this contract comes up. Perhaps not with your agency, but with other agencies. That's important to remember. We want you to be successful. We can help you with compliance issues at IDOA. These are some of the important clauses that I recommend to you to utilize, to not brush over. Use the key persons clause. That helps you and your team, your project manager. And it's important that we stick together. Use your approving agency's help. I know many of you do. And continue to do the great work that you do and be successful in your contract negotiations. I've got some of the other information here about approvals and how it works at IDOA, which you've heard from me over the years. And I want to thank you for your time and joining us today. Here's our contact information. And again, be empowered, be prepared, and be successful. Thank you. Microphone didn't work. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Is that your, okay. All right, good stuff. Thank you, Tammy and Aaron. Appreciate it. Next up, we have Terry Messer with the Indiana Office of Technology to discuss a little bit about state technology contracts. So, Terry?
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Aaron and Tammy, for that good information. All right, so I'd like to start by picking up where I left off last year, if you were here. I asked that you make an effort wherever possible to engage IoT early and often and hit us up with questions, let us know how we can help. And in my experience, that happened in a great way this last year. So I appreciate that you were listening, or that you accidentally happened to start doing that or increase doing that. But I think it's made a significant benefit to our relationships over the last year. And I hope that the coming year will afford us the same opportunity. Maybe something you hear today will help with that. A few basic questions very quickly right off the bat so that we understand why we're even having this conversation, right? So when you engage IoT, why would you do that? Well, there is that pesky statutory authority that we like to wave around, but really it's so that we can help protect you in areas where we have expertise, and also so that we can help protect the state as a whole from decisions that agencies are making and arrangements that they're entering. That's regarding both infrastructure and, in this current environment, as we saw last week, security in an increasing way, right? The answer to when is early and already and 6 months ago, depending on what you're doing. Some things are pretty routine, right? And we talk about those pretty. But if you're engaging cloud services, earlier than early is better. If you're getting into AI, earlier than earlier is better. And if you plan to change the IoT paragraph in the contract template, or not use the cloud terms or modify them if you're buying cloud services, again, if you're getting into AI, you are not wanting to use the cyber liability insurance provision as it stands in the boilerplate. Those are all instances where the sooner we can start a conversation between our teams, the smoother, the faster we can make an approval decision for you. So help us help you, please, in that way. How do you do that? Essentially, at this point, email is our best avenue. That won't always be, but for the time being, emailing our procurement team for procurement and contract questions, emailing our cloud exceptions email if you want to make changes to the boilerplate or some of these other required exhibits. Our cloud security team is a great resource, and as is our vendor management team. And I'll share those links with you at the end of today's IoT discussion. This is a bonus slide for those of you who are playing at home. And I stuck this in here to entice you to join us next month in August for IoT's IT office hours. There'll be some more information about that in a later slide. At any rate, we're working to standardize our turnaround time, and we do our best to let each team and IoT have the time they need to get information from you, review it, collaborate, and then let us make a decision as a team and convey that to you, whether you're getting an approval for a requisition or an SPR or a contract. Looking for operational guidance. That's going to vary widely according to what you're looking for. Oh, thanks. If you are looking for an Archer exception, that's going to take a couple of days if all the information that's needed is presented. And if it isn't, just add that to the total turn time, please. Cloud questionnaires, probably 14 days typically, plus, and I got a little tired of typing here, time to gather additional info as needed. Requisitions, this one was easy, 2 to 5 days. That should, the plus is for anything we need to get from you that's not in the initial submission. But I decided I'd already lost my, my work ethic and put a plus sign there and left it for you. SPRs, same case, probably 21 days in most instances, plus whatever time we need for additional information from you. Contract exceptions, 21 days, and that's fairly firm because that team does not meet as regularly as some of the others. And the reason for that is simply capacity. And we're doing what we can to address that. Plus, and then if you have followed these steps, and especially if you followed them in order, we can get you a contract approval decision, usually in 7 days. Where contract approval decisions are delayed is when a step is missing. Oh, here's a contract that has cloud services in it, but we haven't received a cloud questionnaire. Here's a contract that has changed the IoT paragraph, but the agency didn't talk with us about that before they submitted it for approval. So help us meet these timelines in that way, and we'll be able to assist you. This is a very complicated and impressive flow chart, right? And I thank the PRM team, the project risk management team, and IoT for providing it. We aren't going to talk about this chart today. I provide it for you so that you understand there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than you might think, depending on what your particular role is. So by the time we get all the way to review and update SAL, finalize contract and submit, and then the last purple box, approve contract with SOW, a lot of effort has happened, right? IoT hopefully has been involved if this is an IT procurement, but we've spent time reviewing already early in the process. So I wanted to call attention to 2 things. One is that yellow timeline that says IoT review up to 15 business days when the RFP is in its early stage is an addition to the slide that we just discussed. And then the rest of what we're going to talk about today takes place in that last purple box. This is an example for RFPs, but as you know, the regular contracting process is similar. Okay, this information is courtesy of our PRM team, our project risk management team. And I know most of you have probably either engaged with them or someone you work with in your agency has engaged with them. And I know they're grateful. I can speak on their behalf for that engagement. Here are some key takeaways that they like us to share with regard to RFPs. First of all, why are they involved? IDOA requests, as Tammy was mentioning, IoT review of all IT solicitations prior to posting to the vendor community. We have the approval role on those IT contracts. Here's our theme: engage IoT PRM team early and share near final drafts of procurement and SOW documents. Utilize the team's agency IT procurement kit. There's a link below to enhance your procurement documents. 15 business days, as we touched on in the last slide, for turnaround from those. Cloud security questionnaire if the vendor is giving you services that are not hosted in IoT. And to recap from the earlier slide, because this seems like a message we can't deliver enough, cloud services from IoT's point of view are services that are not provided from IoT. That might be something outside IoT's data center. It might be something outside of IoT's cloud tenant. So whether it's whether the services are viewed as cloud by your vendor or not, please make your evaluation and your engagement based on IoT's definition. And if you need assistance in reaching agreement about that with your vendor, we're happy to help. So we're here to talk about contracts, but I figured a slide about requisitions would be appropriate. The reason is, when we review your contract, we're looking for all the available background we can find. Going to look at the requisition to see if it has enough information to support any questions we have about the contract before we come back to you. Bottom line up front, when IoT approvers review a contract, they look at the status of the requisition. If there is one, clear and sufficient information at that point is going to help speed contract review and approval. This is an example of the kinds of information we would be looking for in the approval justification section of the requisition. You can take a look at that in your packets. That list of information that's helpful for us to have. The next thing we might be looking at in support of review of a contract for approval is an SPR, if there is one. You've noticed, because we've talked about it together individually quite a lot, the SPRs go through a lot of approval steps at IoT. Procurement will review, the PRM team will review, the architect team will review, the security team will review, the CIO will review. Additional review will be done by operations, and if data is involved, by MPH. Reason of that is everyone has a slice of expertise in the overall decision, right? But it does take time to move through those processes. The review, make sure that you've completed the check boxes and other parts of the form, the SPR form that pertain to IoT at the bottom, because that's going to be dead on arrival if it hits us, and we're going to have to ask you to complete it, and we'd rather save you that step. Note, please, that as we discussed earlier, it typically takes us about 21 days to make an approval decision. It could take up to 45. If you haven't heard about the outcome of an SPR, please check internally first, because often those conversations escalate from the procurement and contract level up through executive leadership to executive leadership at the agency in question. So that sometimes can help save a round of communication. As far as contracts and contract exception requests go, a couple of specific takeaways. Requests for document pre-reviews should come to IoT procurement at iot.in.gov to Maddie Alexander. Rush approval requests should be sent to the same email address to the attention of Don. I'd like to take a moment to touch on this last sentence. Please include a description of the circumstances creating the need for rush review. The reason for that is we often receive justification about the importance of a contract itself, what those services are or what that product is. But we are typically asked by our executive leadership to provide information as to the nature of the rush need itself. So yes, I understand that what you're buying or the services that you're procuring are very important. How did it happen to come to a place where a rush was needed? You know, did you have someone go on maternity leave? Did someone fail to, did a vendor fail to provide you timely information, or did a negotiation drag out? Those are the kinds of things that, again, can help us speed up our approval review. Agencies must request IoT approval to change or delete the IoT paragraph, cloud terms, cyber liability insurance provision. This is not new information. I'll leave you on your own to take a look here, but if you have questions, we'll have resources at the end. Information to include as a part of the exception request. This should be a slide that you can see. You've been emailed. It's available in last year's presentation and this presentation, and you can email IoT procurement if you have questions. But these are the 4 basic points that we'd like you to hit so that we can understand the context for your request in addition to the specific information that you provide in your red lines. And we'd like in your red lines to see what your vendor has proposed, what your response is to what the vendor has proposed, and why you think that's an acceptable change to make. Cloud security questionnaires can be accessed through this first email. Requests or questions about contract exceptions can come to the second one. Vendor management is there for you. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in August, we'll have our next IoT procurement office hour. You can get information from iotprocurement.in.gov if you have not already been made a part of that distribution list for that meeting. We'd welcome everyone. We'll go back over the timeline information. We'll recap what we've discussed in the first 6 months of those meetings, and then probably go to a quarterly after that. In February, we'd like to welcome you to our IT purchasing seminar. That'll be February of 2025. And then the last thing that I'd like to leave you with is this request to follow up on the thank you provided at the start. This is a list of IoT resources. We'd appreciate, in addition to using us as a resource, if you can maximize using each other in your agencies as a resource when you're working with IoT, because if we are talking at one level to someone in procurement, and then we've got operations team people talking, and they're not talking together, and then there's an IT director out here in an agency, and our IT director are maybe talking, the better you can help us connect those folks within your agency with those folks within our agency, the better help it is, and we pledge to do the same. So we look forward to another year of working together.
All right, good stuff. Thank you, Terry. Next up, we have the Office of the Attorney General. Before we get to them, I do want to remind everyone, if you're attending for CLE, this seminar has been approved for 3 hours, general, including 1 hour of ethics. We ask that you please turn in your CLE request forms to us within 30 days of the day of this presentation. So, hello, and on behalf of Attorney General Todd Rokita and the entire Office of the Attorney General, my name is Bill Anthony. I serve as the Chief Counsel of the Advisory Division in our Indiana Attorney General's office. With me today, who you'll hear from shortly, are Chris Anderson and James Harry, who both serve as Deputy Attorneys General within the Advisory Division. So as we get started, I want you to know Attorney General Rokita's office functions as the official law firm for the state of Indiana. In fact, at any given time, we are involved in more than 20,000 active legal cases. As the state's law firm, we defend laws passed by the Indiana General Assembly if they are challenged in the courts. We defend agencies, office holders, and state employees if they are sued in their official capacities. We work to uphold criminal convictions when defendants appeal. Attorney General Rokita's office has successfully upheld verdicts against child abusers, murderers, rapists, and other criminals as we work to protect victims, their families, and all Hoosiers. As part of this mission, we provide various victims services as well, such as the Address Confidentiality Program, a free service that enables victims of certain crimes like human trafficking to have confidential home addresses. Through our Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, we also work to ensure Medicaid dollars are spent on healthcare and not fraud. So far, Attorney General Rakita's office has recovered more than $85 million in misspent Medicaid funds. As you may see in the news from time to time, we also work to protect Hoosiers through our Consumer Protection Division, educating citizens and protecting them from illicit business practices such as deception, fraud, cybersecurity threats, data privacy violations, and identity theft. We have obtained more than $1 billion in settlements for Hoosiers, including hundreds of thousands from annoying and illegal robocallers. We also handle unclaimed property in the Attorney General's office, helping reunite hardworking Hoosiers with their own money. Our office achieved a record of more than $81 million returned just in 2023 alone. So we are very busy. To carry out all the tasks for which our office is responsible, Attorney General Rakita oversees a staff of over 400 people with one common purpose, serving Hoosiers with servants' hearts. Under Attorney General Rakita's leadership, our ultimate mission is to serve, protect, and defend Hoosiers by championing liberty, justice, and the rule of law. And so, as part of our overall mission, I'm glad that we're here with you today to discuss the office's role in the state contract process and to share information with you to help further your understanding of state contracts. As counsel to state agencies and contract administrators, I hope you find this information beneficial as you negotiate your contract terms with selected vendors. The role the Office of the Attorney General plays in the state contract process is occupied by the Advisory Division. The Advisory Division is comprised of 11 attorneys and 2 assistants. Through June, we have reviewed approximately 3,345 contracts in this calendar year alone. Our average review time continuously hovers around 5 days. Say that again, 5 days. That's the time from receipt to the time we approve a contract. I'm quite proud of the diligence and efficiency of my staff and of the service we're able to provide in this regard. So I will now turn the presentation over to Chris and James, who will go through some further information with you in detail. Thank you for allowing us to present this information to you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and we hope that the information you glean from this presentation is useful as you go and negotiate with your contractors. One of our goals today, as you've heard, is to go a bit deeper into some of the topics that often come up as problem areas in negotiating your contracts. And so at the end of the day, we intend to go through several of the clauses that are repeat offenders or cause the most problems that we see routinely. The first few slides that we're going to go through here, however, are basic information that are foundational to what we do. These are things that you've probably all seen before if you've been here in the past. And so we'll go pretty quickly through all this, not touching on every single point, but it is here for your reference if you need to go back. So what to know about the Office of the Attorney General. We do review. We have 45 days to review a contract once it comes in. As Bill mentioned, we're often much quicker than that, and we pride ourselves on that. This is a task that's carried out by our various deputies in the office. And really what we have are 3 options when we encounter a contract that potentially poses a problem. We can outright disapprove a contract. I will tell you that we prefer not to do that at all costs. We often, if we encounter something, you may have received an email from one of us talking through the various scenarios and discussing what your potential changes could be or how you would address that scenario. We often try to provide our justification in writing for why a contract needs to be revised, why there's something in it that we cannot approve. And ultimately, we try to work with you all to create a solution so that contract doesn't have to go back and start over and get redrafted. But we try to reach a solution to be able to move that contract along quickly. And in times when it's necessary, we do provide rush reviews for you all to help get contracts that are under a deadline through when it's necessary. But we do ask that you use that privilege sparingly for everyone's benefit. So this is basic information, contracts 101, but what is a contract? Well, it's an agreement between two or more parties creating obligations that are enforceable or otherwise recognizable at law. And so what we have here in the second paragraph is here we go. What we have here is a statement from Indiana courts, and this is pretty consistent with how all courts look at our contracts if there is a dispute on how it's to be interpreted. What you'll note from this is that courts look for whether a contract is ambiguous or unambiguous first. And they're going to go through the different provisions that are in dispute and ask that question. Ultimately, what courts are looking for when they look at our contracts or any contract that comes before them is what is the intent of the parties in writing the contract that way. And so this is a reminder to you all as you draft your contracts to be very intentional in how you're explaining what the obligations between the parties are. This is something that courts will pay very close attention to, and it's something that we pay close attention to in our office as well as we review these on your behalf. So a summary a bit is the goals in contract drafting. You need to be clear as can be. Try to avoid ambiguous language, try to use confusing terms. Don't try to write your contract like a 13th century scholar, but use modern language. Be concise, don't be too wordy. Use short, simple sentences. Use the active voice, try to make it as clear as possible what the obligations that you're trying to lay out are actually conveying. Don't use prohibited terms. We're going to talk through and provide you with a list of those terms that can never be included in our state contracts. But the second you see a term in there that might qualify, it should raise a red flag for you to look closer and make sure that that would be something that can or cannot be in there. Include all the necessary boilerplate. So as agencies of the state, there are special legal provisions that must be in every state contract, and we need to ensure that that language is in there, not only to comply with state law, but to protect state interests as well. Perform a risk assessment. This is something that may not come up all that often in your agencies, but it's something that we often encourage is just because a term might be able to be approved doesn't necessarily mean that it should. You need to be weighing, if a contractor is proposing certain language, does it really warrant the risks that it might pose to the state? And then when in doubt, feel free to reach out to IDOA or OAG. As I noted, we often work with our agencies to help do pre-reviews, look at specific language. If you have questions, we're often a sounding board for your benefit. And then these are the terms that we look for in every single contract. We look at the term, whether your dates line up. If you're saying your contract's being amended to extend for a year, 6 months and 3 days, we do the math to make sure that your starting and end dates actually line up with that time frame. The consideration, does the amount of the contract reflect the same throughout the entire agreement in the exhibits and in amendments? Does your math add up? So we look at those things as well. The parties, making sure that the contract is properly signed by people who have the proper authority, making sure that your exhibits are there, that they're labeled correctly. And then again, making sure that those various clauses are in there that need to be, and the ones that can't be in there are not.
All right. Morning, and thank you, James, for that. So as James mentioned, we have in our review, we have clauses that are always required by statute and executive order, and we have clauses that are prohibited. So just to continue with this introduction, I'm going to briefly touch on a few of those items. So first, we have the required clauses. Yeah, by statute, sometimes by executive order, we have to see these in the contract. If we don't see them, then it's highly, highly likely that your contract is going to be rejected. Just a few examples, we have the ethics clause, the telephone privacy clause, the funding cancellation clause. And I think there's at least 10 of these clauses in the boilerplate language that we need to see every time. In years past, we've gone into more detail for each one. This year, we're just kind of going to briefly touch on them. And they're listed behind me. They're also on the IDOA contracting manual on their website. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions about that. On the flip side, we also have provisions, clauses that are absolutely prohibited in contracts. And if we see them, we also will have to reject a contract. For example, any provision requiring the state to, there we go, to provide insurance, to provide indemnity, to pay taxes, any provision requiring payments in advance of services. Those are just some of the examples, but once again, the entire list is here, and on the next slide, quite a few of them. And they're also in the IDOA contracting manual. So as James mentioned, we want to dig a little deeper this year into certain clauses or provisions that maybe are not absolutely required in every case. Often they are, but we think that they're often important, often misunderstood, and overlooked. So we just want to address those and why they are important, and why you should consider keeping them in the contract, even when the contractor pushes back and says, no, 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 we don't want this. So first, we're going to turn to the termination for convenience clause, which I believe Tammy mentioned in her presentation, and just address the important role that it plays in state contracts. So first of all, what is the termination for convenience clause? Well, broadly speaking, the termination for convenience clause, also known as the TFC, easy enough, allows the state to end a contract when the state finds it convenient, without needing to establish that the other party is in default of its obligations or duties. Now, the boilerplate language that we use in our contracts is somewhat lengthy, so instead of just reading straight through it, I thought it'd be easier to break it up into smaller sections and address it as such. Before I go on, just to clarify, this TFC language is boilerplate language in both contracts and our grants. There are some minor differences between the two, but for all intents and purposes, legally speaking, it's going to be virtually identical. So I'll be addressing the language in the contracts. Okay, so it starts by saying this contract may be terminated in whole or in part by the state, which shall include and is not limited to IDOA and the state budget agency. So here, the first thing I'd like to point out is that only the state can terminate for convenience. Now, there's another clause in the boilerplate language that allows a contractor to terminate if the state doesn't fulfill its obligations or if there's default, but only the state gets this TFC language. So as a practical pointer, if we see a contract coming to our office and it proposes to give the contractor the right to terminate for convenience, and it's going to be rejected. So why does the state get to have this language? Private contractors don't. Right of the state to terminate for convenience historically derives from the state's sovereign immunity, but it also takes into consideration the state's large size and unique duty to act in the public interest. Now, similar language such as this is used in states across the country, and even the federal government routinely uses this in their contracts. So this is not at all unique to Indiana, but it is unique to the government. So while a private contractor might be free to focus its contracting on maximizing its profits, that's what they do, the state has to balance a host of different factors. Economic efficiency, adjusting to constantly changing circumstances, fulfilling its duties to the public at large, and just generally acting in a manner that's fair and just for all parties. They're just things that the state needs to consider and be responsible for that private contractors don't. So just given the size of the state and the important responsibilities and duties that it has, sometimes it's just not feasible for the state to remain obligated to a contract that's no longer in the public's best interests. So next we see that the TFC clause can be invoked by the state as a whole, not just the individual agency entering into the contract. So IDOA, SBA, and the OAG can all act to terminate the contract for convenience if deemed necessary. Simply reflects that each of those agencies has its own areas of responsibility, its own areas of expertise, and may have different reasons to terminate a contract. So the state is inclusive of the state as a whole, not the separate contracting agency that might be entering into that contract. Finally, on this section, termination of a contract is not necessarily all or nothing. The state can choose to terminate only a particular part of a contract while leaving the rest intact, provided there are no issues with severability or the like. So once again, this just goes back to giving the state flexibility. It needs to accomplish its purpose. So if you have a multi-million-dollar contract with multiple parts and subparts, but only one small part is problematic, you don't need to cancel the whole contract. You just cancel that one issue and the rest can remain as part of the contract. Okay, there we go. Hard to see behind me. So it goes on to say that whenever for any reason the state determines that such termination is in its best interest. Extremely broad language used here gives the state wide latitude to terminate a contract if it desires. The state does not need a compelling reason to terminate a contract. It only needs to rationalize its decision as being in the best interest of the state, which as I mentioned, is an advantage that private contractors don't get. With that said, the state's right to terminate for convenience is not absolute. All contracting parties, including the state, are held to a standard of good faith in their dealings. And so in the rare occasion when the state's good faith has been raised in a lawsuit, courts have come to differing conclusions on when has a state not acted in good faith. It's not common, but you do see it occasionally. Now, some courts have been more lenient to the state and have held that there must be clear and convincing evidence that the government's termination was made meant to injure. Now, other courts have held that a change in circumstances is necessary to invoke the TFC clause in good faith. And to my knowledge, there's no controlling test in Indiana at this point. So it's kind of a mixed bag as far as which test you would theoretically get in court. Just be aware that while you do have a lot of discretion in TFC clauses to invoke it, to terminate, there is this good faith threshold that has to be met in all cases. Goes on to say that termination of services shall be effected by delivery to the contractor of a termination notice of at least 30 days prior to the termination of effective date, specifying the extent to which performance of services under such termination becomes effective. So of course, any termination, whether it's under the default clause or the TFC clause, requires the state to give a written notice of termination to the contractor. Under the state's boilerplate language, in order to be effective, that notice has to be given 30 days in advance of the termination date. Now, that number can be subject to some negotiation if after doing a proper risk analysis, negotiation, you can negotiate a number that's longer than 30 days if that's good for the parties. But I would caution that any number under 30 days should really be approached with caution, and I would advise against it, because the shorter time frame you are looking at, the more likely that a court might find that the contract is a sense illusory and not enforceable. You don't remember from your law school days, a contract is illusory when the promises under the contract appear so insubstantial as to impose no obligation at all on the promiser, who says in effect, I will if I want to. This very issue was raised in a Florida lawsuit where a transportation company alleged that a contract with the state was illusory because the TFC clause allowed the state to back out of any obligations under the contract. Now, in that case, the court rejected the argument because it found, well, there's this 90-day notice requirement. In that case, it was 90 days. So its obligations were not illusory. But it's just a caution. The fewer days you get for that notice period, more issues you're probably going to run into in court. It goes on to say that the contractor shall be compensated for services properly rendered prior to the effective date of termination. State will not be liable for services performed after the effective date of termination. The contractor shall be compensated for services herein provided, but in no case shall total payment made to the contractor exceed the original contract price, or shall any price increase be allowed on individual line items if canceled only in part prior to the original termination date. So a primary benefit of terminating a contract for convenience, so that the state can, if circumstances change, back out and it's not responsible for paying the compensation under the entirety of the contract as originally agreed. This provision simply makes it very explicit that the state is not on the hook for the entire contract, but only for the services performed up to that termination date. And of course, so this is one factor to take into consideration when you're trying to figure out how long the notice period. If it's too short of a notice period, you run the risk of an illusory contract, but too long of a notice period, and you are responsible for compensating for any services for that whole window. So 90 days, 120 days, you name it. Provision also states that if the state only terminates part of the contractor can't turn around and bump up its prices for the remaining parts of the contract and try to make up that difference. I'm assuming this is something we've seen before, which is why it's here. But in your contracting, if you see a contractor trying to raise their prices in other areas after you've partially invoked the TFC clause, definitely a red flag, and that's probably going to need to be addressed. Finally, it states that for purposes of this paragraph, the parties stipulate and agree that IDOA shall be deemed to be a party of this contract with authority to terminate the same for convenience when such termination is determined by the Commissioner of IDOA to be in the best interest of the state. So really, this provision just circles back to the beginning and emphasizes an even more explicit language that as a party to the contract, IDOA has the authority to invoke the TFC clause in addition to the agency. Since IDOA is the agency that's primarily responsible for contracts under state statute, the General Assembly just wanted to make sure that IDOA's authority here was abundantly clear. And so the contractor can't come back and say, oh, we didn't know that they had the power to invoke the TFC clause. So just to wrap up on the termination for convenience, you know, sometimes, yeah, this language is not absolutely necessary. It's not one of the required clauses. However, it really serves to protect the state, specifically your agency. And it's really a clause that just helps to protect the public interest. And it should be considered as just part of doing cost of business with the state. It's a privilege to do business with the state. And contractors just need to realize this is going to be part of the cost, that because of the state's unique duties and responsibilities, they're going to have this termination for convenience clause. And I think you have wide discretion to use it, provided that you're acting in good faith. So I would just encourage you to keep it in your contracts when at all possible.
All right, so we're going to jump into our next topic here. And I found this quote, and this is, I thought, timely. So with that happy note, let's proceed. Right, so this is the standard indemnification language you would see in every state contract. And we're going to walk through it in parts here just to pull out some of the key elements. So first of all, you have the action. So what's happening here? The contractor is indemnifying, they are defending, they are holding harmless the state. So those terms, indemnify, defend, hold harmless, they essentially all mean the same thing. So something to be aware of if a contractor is proposing revisions to the contract or attaching exhibits, and you're seeing language that doesn't say indemnify, but it's using these other terms, just know that is essentially indemnification that they are proposing. So something to be aware of. The parties covered by our provision, you've got the contractor as well as their subcontractors. So when a contractor agrees to use this language, they are also binding any subcontractors they use to perform the work under the contract. And then on the other side of it, you've got the state, and it's pretty broad here as well. You've got the state, its agents, its officials, its employees. It's meant to cover basically anyone within the state who might have exposure under this contract for operating. The claims, you'll see here that these are indemnification from all third-party claims and suits. So what is a third-party claim or suit? Well, it's a person or organization who initiates a suit, and they are not a party to a standing legal relationship that exists. So they're not a party to the contract, they're outside of the duties, but they are making a claim based on actions that occurred pursuant to the contract. You've got the damages here. Notice that it says including these damages, so this is not an exhaustive list, but they're court costs, attorney's fees, expenses. Obviously, this could also be damages of various nature, punitive, compensatory. The scope here, you've got acts or omissions arising from the performance of the contract. This is useful to you all to know that our indemnification is not a wide, all encumbering provision here. It is tied to the performance and the products and services that the contractor is providing in the contract itself. And then lastly, note that the liability here is shifting. So what this does is it creates a one-way street where the contractor is agreeing to defend us, to hold us harmless, and the reverse is absolutely not occurring here. So the last sentence, the state will not provide indemnification to the contractor. This is intentional, and it goes back to, we try to make our intent absolutely clear in writing these contracts. Sure, how courts tend to look at indemnification provisions. An indemnity agreement involves a promise by one party to reimburse another party for the indemnity's loss, damage, or liability. It's the general legal understanding of indemnity clauses is that they cover the risk of harm sustained by third persons that might be caused by either the indemnitor or the indemnity. It shifts the financial burden for the ultimate payment of damages from the indemnity, in our case, the state, to the indemnitor. And courts construe an indemnity agreement to cover all losses and damages to which it reasonably appears the parties intended it to apply. So again, paying attention to the specific words that contractors might propose in changing a clause like this is absolutely important to its interpretation down the road. And you might have, in your negotiations with contractors, heard, well, that's fine, we'll agree to indemnify you, but we also want you, as a show of good faith, to indemnify us as well. We'll indemnify our bad acts and you indemnify yours, and everyone's happy. But there are several key reasons that we can never agree to do this, and the state's in the unique position where we absolutely cannot. There are two primary concerns here. So the first, And by the way, when parties are both offering indemnification, that's often referred to as cross indemnification. So you may hear that term. The first is a constitutional concern. So the Indiana Constitution, Article 10, Section 3 provides no money shall be drawn from the treasury, but in pursuance of appropriations made by law. So as you all may be aware, the legislature meets every 2 years to set a budget. Money is allocated to the various agencies to carry out their duties. Money is allocated for specific projects and for contracts, and each dollar is tracked and accounted for. So if the state is offering indemnity to a contractor, essentially what we are doing is accepting liability to keep the contractor free from loss. And how that would play out is we are essentially saying, okay, we'll agree to pay the contract amount, plus we have an unknown amount that may come up down the road if there is a suit and the contractor's held liable for damages, or one of the parties is held liable for damages. Now, all of a sudden, what we've done is agreed to pay the contract amount in addition to an unknown amount that has not been allocated or budgeted by law. And so the Constitution says that's not allowed. The state would be agreeing to pay money that has not been allocated. And then the second primary reason is a statutory concern. So you might be thinking, well, could the state ever be liable in a situation? And the answer is yes. But the legislature has gone to great lengths to specify which situations a state agency could be liable in. And that's laid out in the Indiana Tort Claim Act at IC 3413-3. And what this statute does is really three primary things. It provides that there's a list of enumerated acts for which the state has absolute liability. And you can go look those up, but there's quite a long laundry list there of when the state could never be liable. But there are other situations if the state is found at fault for tortious conduct, negligence, intentional acts, that the state could be subject to a claim. And so the Indiana Tort Claim Act sets forth a procedure for making those claims known to the state and giving us time to respond to those and assess them. And lastly, most importantly probably, is that it provides damage cap amounts for the most that the state, depending on the type of governmental entity we're talking about, could be liable in one of these situations, and it caps our ultimate damages. And so what we're doing if we agree to indemnify a contractor is essentially we're contracting outside the protections of the Indiana Tort Claim Act. And we now might be agreeing to pay damages beyond those capped amounts. We might be agreeing to defend a contractor for actions that would otherwise be considered immune under the Tort Claim Act. And so these are things to keep in mind as you explain this to contractors, but we want to stay within the boundaries of the Tort Claim Act in writing our contracts. Oh, and also the Attorney General's office is ultimately tasked with defending all suits brought against the state. And so arguably under an indemnification provision, the contractor could be responsible for defending their own suit. And what we've done then is essentially outsourced our right to defend the state's rights through a contract. So that's one more aspect to this. Okay, here's a hypothetical. The OAG contracts with D-Minus Construction to build Bill Anthony a new big desk to hold the voluminous stacks of contracts submitted for his review. D-Minus Construction builds a hastily constructed desk that soon collapses due to the excessive weight of contracts piled on top. And unfortunately for Bill, he was sitting at the desk when the desk collapsed, and he sustained substantial injuries to his big toe. Understandably, Bill is upset because he now limps when he walks down to give James Harry assignments. And Bill sues the state for negligence and for creating an unsafe work environment. And after an arduous court battle, Bill wins monetary damages against the OAG. So who would be responsible in this scenario? Well, if you've correctly negotiated the indemnification language, then in this case, the damages at fault here are arising out of the contract. They're arising out of the work performed. And so very likely the contractor would be responsible to pay any damages arising under the suit. And you could tweak the hypothetical a little bit to say, well, what if we had already provided cross indemnification to the contractor? Well, in that case, very likely we would be in a not unconstitutional situation, a problematic statutory situation where we've now put ourselves in a position where we're paying damages beyond what we contracted for, and those monies have not been allocated. So some things to think about here as you work through these clauses with contractors. Go back to the specific language of the clause itself. Explain to them how it is narrow in scope. It is tied only to the services that are performed under the contract. Explain to them that this is only for specific types of suits that are brought against the state. And explain to them the need, as you've heard today, we have thousands and thousands of contracts that the state enters into every year. And we don't have the latitude to be subject to these types of claims on every single contract. And so this is something we do to protect the state's best interests. Remind them, as you've heard, that it's a great benefit to do business with the state. Explain that we have legal prohibitions against entering into these types of agreements by cross indemnifying a contractor. As we talked about this morning, the constitutional and statutory concerns. And then you may agree to minor modifications, although we recommend you don't. You might limit the scope further to what the contractor could ultimately be liable for. However, again, you can never agree to provide indemnification back to the contractor. So those are some things to take with you as you negotiate. Now we're going to move into a second topic here, limitation of liability, which is tied to indemnification. It's something we see come up from time to time in our office, but contractors may say, okay, we'll agree to indemnify you. However, we want some limitation of liability language in there. So what these, what I'll call LOL clauses, they create a contractual ceiling on the amount of damages that may be awarded if a plaintiff prevails in litigation between the parties. So it's really bringing down what the contractor's ultimate exposure might be. And I provided an example of a limitation of liability clause that we've seen recently. You can see here that it basically limits all damages of any kind. This could also be included to say damages that the state sustains from breach of contract beyond those of just third-party claims. So this is a broad provision. And in this case, they've chosen a specific amount of $5 million to say this is the most we would ever pay for loss under this agreement. Some contracts will say, well, the ultimate amount that we would ever pay is the amount of remuneration in the contract, the consideration amount. So whatever the contract value is, we're never going to agree to pay more than that. So then you've got a question of, well, what happens if there are damages that go beyond the price of the contract itself? Here's a case study that I found from our 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, and this is a hotel group that worked with the contractor apparently to build a building, and it was a faulty design, and the hotel sues the contractor, and they allege that they have $4.2 million in damages after they have to demolish the building completely, but they had a limitation of liability clause in their contract. And the hotel argued that the contractor was not entitled to invoke the limitation of liability clause because it didn't call out their negligence specifically. It just used the general reference to negligence. And so the court looks at this and they ultimately say, Indiana courts have long recognized and respected the freedom of parties to enter into contracts. They look at the key language again, that it has to be clear and unequivocally manifest a commitment by the plaintiff to knowingly and willingly make and to pay for damages occasioned by the defendant's negligence. And then ultimately they say the general rule of freedom of contract includes the freedom to make a bad bargain. And so this is what courts will look at if you have a contract go awry. They ultimately, in this case, find that the limitation of liability clause did apply, And so the hotel that sustained $4.2 million in damages got $70,000 at the end of the day to cover their loss. And so some final takeaways on limitation of liability clauses. Just be aware of them when you see them pop up. Look at them closely, read them closely, and understand exactly what do they cover. What are the types of damages that are invoked? Is this an all-encompassing clause? Ask whether there might be potential damages beyond those called out in the contract itself. You know, if the cap and damages is going to be here, but you could foresee a situation where damages from an outside party could be much higher, well, someone's going to have to pick those up at the end of the day. And so we need to be thinking about how we're going to handle those different situations in contract. Think about what type of insurance your contractor has in place. What are the limits of that insurance? Does it cover the various types of situations you could see this contract potentially running into? We hate to look at all of our contracts in a negative light, but we do want to pay attention to those things. And ultimately, look at the scope of the clause and ask, just because, you know, we can enter into a limitation of liability agreement, does that necessarily mean it's in the state's best interest to do so?
Thank you. And for our final section, we just want to briefly talk about the assignment of antitrust claims clause. Likely a clause that you and your contractors frequently skip over without even a second thought. But it's really worth taking a closer look just to see what exactly it does. So basically, it ensures that the state may recover for antitrust claims that arise between the contractor and its subcontractors or vendors. Now, the clause itself is relatively brief. It states that as part of the consideration for the award of this contract, the contractor assigns to the state all right, title, and interest, and to any claims the contractor now has or may acquire under state or federal antitrust laws relating to the products or services which are subject to this contract. I'm assuming most of us here have at least some vague familiarity with antitrust laws, at least as it pertains to large tech companies in the news like Google or Amazon. But what are they? What do they do? In the words of the Indiana Court of Appeals, it's a compilation of federal and state laws that regulate the conduct and organization of businesses in order to prevent fraud and collusion in the letting of contracts and to protect trade and commerce against unlawful restraints and monopolies. So in other words, the purpose of antitrust laws are to promote healthy competition between companies, not allow certain companies to act in ways that enable them to unfairly dominate their industry or sector. So you have the federal antitrust laws and the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, and the Federal Trade Commission Act, and the state antitrust laws, which overlap substantially with the federal laws, are in Title 24, Article 1. Generally, they prohibit price fixing, monopolies, contracts to prevent competition, and just other actions that unfairly undermine the ability of other companies to compete in the marketplace. So just a quick example to give you an idea how it works and how it impacts the state. So this is a case from several decades ago. It's actually a famous case that the Supreme Court took up from Illinois. It's Illinois Brick Company versus Illinois. And in this case, several manufacturers of concrete blocks in the Chicago area conspired together to artificially raise their prices of blocks, resulting in, of course, higher prices than what they should have been. And so those manufacturers then sold the blocks to masonry contractors. So masonry contractors then turned around and sold those blocks to the general contractors. And finally, later, when the state of Illinois entered into the contracts with the general contractors for completion of some masonry projects, the state ended up paying a lot more money than necessary because the cost of the blocks was so artificially inflated. And in this case, I think the state of Illinois paid $3 million more than otherwise, just because those original manufacturers conspired together to raise the prices. So now you would think, that if the state of Illinois lost over $3 million because of this conspiracy, they'd have no problem recovering that money in court. But in this case, the Supreme Court actually held that the state of Illinois that since they were not a direct purchaser of the blocks, but only an indirect purchaser from the general contractors, they couldn't bring federal antitrust claims. And so they couldn't recover. And this is one important reason that we have this assignment clause in our contract. It essentially puts the state in the shoes of the contractors for all legal purposes. So making us essentially the direct purchaser of goods so we can bring a claim. Now that's federal. The state antitrust laws do specifically allow the state to bring claims even when we're only an indirect purchaser. But it's still good to have this assignment clause because it would just enable us to recover more in damages than we otherwise would be able to. And I think it's a recognition that the state generally is the proper actor to be policing these antitrust laws, especially since a lot of the contractors, frankly, they're not going to want to sue. They're not going to want to bring antitrust claims against their subcontractors because that's going to have a really bad effect on the work relationship. So they don't want to do it. And oftentimes they're happy to assign these rights to the state. So just to conclude, this clause is important. All these clauses, everything we've talked about is important, even the ones that are not strictly required. I hope that by digging a little deeper into these, that you can see that these often overlooked provisions are important. You can see why they're included as boilerplate language. And it's not only in your agency's best interest, but also the state's best interest to have this language in our contract. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
All right, good stuff. Thank you, Chris and James. Appreciate it. Next up, we have Eric Kleinfelter with the State Budget Agency to talk about funding cancellation clauses. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning. My name is Eric Kleinfelter. I am the Director of Centralized Accounting for the Indiana State Budget Agency. Today, I'm going to provide you with some background on the State Budget Agency, go beyond the basics regarding some contracting financial management circulars, and speak to the SBA contracting approval process. State Budget Agency, referred to as SBA, is charged with the duty and responsibility of serving as fiscal analyst, administrative budget officer, fiscal forecaster, and fiscal policy advisor to the governor. By statute, the governor appoints the state budget director and 2 deputy directors. SBA facilitates the process of revenue forecasting and budget development and implementation. SBA is also responsible for evaluating the fiscal and policy impacts of legislative proposals and making this information available to decision makers. Each biennium, SBA compiles fiscal data from state agencies and works with the legislator to develop the state's budget. More information about SBA can be found in Title IV, Article 12, Chapter 1 of Indiana Code. I want to specifically mention Indiana Code 4-12-1-13. This Indiana code allows SBA to adopt and enforce financial guidelines for state agencies to follow. The Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, has similar authority under IC 4-3-22-4. We refer to this guidance as financial management circulars, or as I will refer to them in this presentation as FMCs. This authority primarily applies to only executive branch agencies under IC 4-12-1-13G. For today's purposes, I'll be discussing the FMCs found at the link at the bottom of this slide. The first FMC I want to present is FMC 3.1, Contract Management. Section 1 is the purpose. The purpose of this policy is to advise agencies on the minimum requirements of managing state contracts consistent with the responsible stewardship of state resources. Section 4 is the authority to sign contracts. Only staff designated in writing by the agency head have the authority to bind the state and sign contracts on behalf of an agency. Section 5 speaks to grant versus contract. A contract and a grant contain the same essential elements: competent parties, lawful subject matter, sufficient consideration, and consent of minds. However, a contract creates state procurement relationships, and grants create state assistance relationships. The contract manual provides agencies with the required clauses of any contract and additional guidance on the contract versus grant determination. Each agency is responsible for reviewing the funding source that supports the grant or contract to ensure the proper agreement is utilized. Section 7 mentions accounting for contracts. Budget accounting for contracts should follow the principles established in the State Board of Accounts Manual. In covering contracts, Section 3.2.4 of the manual states that the total amount of the vendor contract should be encumbered on the purchase order, including amount to be paid in future years, unless a specific exception has been granted by the state budget agency or the auditor's office, which is now the comptroller's office. Multi-year contracts and leases, Section 5.4.1.8 of the SBOA manual provides that all contracts and commitments must be entered into the PeopleSoft financial system in order to create an encumbrance for the funds committed. For contracts or leases spanning more than one fiscal year, all years should be accounted for in the initial requisition by using a separate line for each fiscal year. Section 11 speaks to the contract closeout. A contract is complete when all goods, services have been received and accepted in full, all reports were provided and accepted, and final payment is made to the contractor. FMC 3.3 provides the following language for cancellation of contracts that must be in any contract. Contracts will not be approved by SBA without this cancellation language. This cancellation language reads as follows. When the director of the state budget agency makes a written determination that funds are not appropriated or otherwise available to support continuation of performance of this contract, the contract shall be canceled. A determination by the director of the state budget agency that funds are not appropriated or otherwise available to support continuation of performance shall be final and conclusive. FMC 3.4 was effective on March 1st, 2024. This FMC provides information on MOUs and MOAs. MOUs are memorandums of understanding, which are generally considered formalized written agreements between state agencies that cannot be enforced in court and which involve programmatic and/or fiscal issues that enunciate mutual understanding, agreements, duties, responsibilities, policies, procedures, timeframes, and other matters as necessary and appropriate. MOAs are mutual memorandums of agreements, which are generally considered formalized written agreements between a state agency and another party, including a private entity, that does not contain enforceable premises. These agreements include things such as letters of intent or letters of agreement that memorialize the intent of the parties to collaborate. Agreements between a state agency and another entity can include provisions that could enforce in court, but must be memorialized by a contract that is subject to review under IC 4-13-2-14.1. Section 2 of this FMC is the general policy. Due to the possibility of direct and indirect state fiscal impact, SBA's general policy is that all MOUs between state agencies require SBA review and approval. Section 4 is the duration. Generally, no MOU should extend a term more than 4 years, original term plus renewals. Now, the term can't be to infinity and beyond, but exceptions beyond the 4 years may be approved by SBA. Section 7 speaks to the federal sub-state awards. If a state agency, the granting agency, awards federal funds to another state agency, the sub-state agency, the agency must enter into an MOU that provides the sub-state agency with specific federal information, which is listed in this FMC. Also, sub-state agencies are not considered subrecipients. FMC 4.1 is the Federal Grants Management Guidelines, which was effective on July 1st, 2024. Two key sections from this FMC is Section 2 and Section 9. Section 2 mentions that SBA has implemented a statewide grants management system known as the Enterprise Grants Management System. This system shall be used for all executive branch agencies to track federal and state grants throughout the life cycle of the grant. Section 9 is the failure to comply. The purpose of the FMC is to make sure agencies have internal controls in place to successfully manage federal assistance. It is important to reiterate that each federal award may have unique rules and regulations that are not covered in this FMC. Therefore, agencies must read and understand the unique requirements of its federal award and create internal controls to support the effective management of the federal assistance. I also want to share that SBA is working with IDOA and the Attorney General's office to update the grant agreement templates for federal grants. The reason the grant agreement templates for federal grants are being updated is an effort to comply for the Uniform Grant Guidance. This slide speaks to the fiscal issues that SBA is looking for when reviewing a contract for approval. SBA is looking at the total cost of the contract, the fiscal year by fiscal year impact, funding sources, impact of the contract to the agency's budget and spending plan, which may require CFO sign-off, cost per unit, per hour, per product. SBA may also work with the agency's financial staff or controllers to understand the financial impact of the contract. When reviewing contracts for approval, SBA tries to review each contract within 5 working days of receipt. For high-priority contracts coming through for approval, advance notice and information is helpful to SBA. When SBA is reviewing contracts, there are delegations based on the consideration amount of the contract. Contracts with total consideration of $2 million or less are approved by the budget analysts. Contracts with total considerations greater than $2 million but less than $10 million are approved by the division directors. And contracts with total considerations of $10 million or greater are approved by the deputy budget director. This slide provides a link to the SBA website as well as the agency phone number. I'm also providing the link to the contact the SBA grants management team as we are at the beginning of the new statewide grants management system. With that, I want to thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you found this information helpful and that it has provided you with a better understanding of SBA and how SBA fits into the state's contracting process. Thank you.
All right. We had a lot of information thus far. So we have about 10 or so minutes reserved for questions. If anyone has any questions, we still have IDOA here, IoT, SBA, as well as the Office of the Attorney General. What's that? Probably not. Anybody? Questions? Okay. Well, then I guess we'll take our 15-minute break a little early. Let's come back, let's say 10 till 11 as we wrap up with the Office of Inspector General.
Hello. Hello.
decide either way. If you don't. Again. I don't mind. Or in. I'd like to share with you. Yeah, we can share. Yeah, we're friends.
Oh, no.
Howard? Yeah, I'll have the turnaround. We have a clicker? It should be.
I'll need to remind them.
No, no.
That's like their time and then.
I can get a glance at it. I wonder if we could. Yeah.
Not to lift anything.
Oh, absolutely. Do what you need.
Okay, I like that better. We're not blocking everything.
Doreen.
Okay.
Yes. I will say, it's not that we don't like you, it's that.
Yeah.
Oh, she's taking pictures already, guys. Making an important point. All of our points are important.
All right, it is now 10:50. Welcome back from your break. We're gonna get right into it. We have representatives here from the Office of Inspector General, Tiffany Mulligan, Doreen Clark, and Hope Blankenberger. They're gonna go over ethics and state contracting, jurisdiction, rules, and penalties. That, I'll turn it over to the Inspector General team. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for sticking around for the last hour of the CLE today. And thank you to the Office of Attorney General and the Indiana Department of Administration and other agencies for putting this seminar on today. It's really nice to have relevant CLE for state government, and our office puts on an annual conference every year. We know how much work it is to do that, so we appreciate their work in putting this on. As Bill said, my name is Tiffany Mulligan. I'm the Chief of Staff and Chief Legal Counsel with the Indiana Office of Inspector General. And with me today are Hope Blankenberger and Doreen Clark. I wanted to say to start out, it's not that we don't like Doreen. We wanted to be able to see the screen, so not have someone exactly in front of the screen. So we moved the tables a bit today. But we're really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and we're excited to tell you a little bit about the Indiana Office of Inspector General and what we do. Remind you again about the Code of Ethics rules. Hopefully all of you are somewhat familiar with those rules already, but we want to highlight those rules that are specifically relevant for state contracting. So with that, one quick announcement too, I wanted to mention for the lawyers in the room or for ethics officers that are interested, we have a legal and ethics conference our office puts on every year. We are scheduled to do that on November 19th. So if you want to save the date, more information to come and likely sometime in October, but wanted to mention that to you as a starting point. So here's what we hope to cover today. We want to provide you with an overview of the Office of Inspector General, our duties and jurisdiction to help you understand what we do, but more importantly, what resources are available to you as state employees through the Indiana Office of Inspector General. We're also going to cover some specific ethics rules and examples of some of the rules that come up most frequently for those of you that are involved with contracting on a day-to-day basis. And then, because we're the Office of Inspector General and we deal with enforcement, we want to make you aware of what penalties are out there if you or one of your team members violates the Indiana Code of Ethics. So have to be the bearer of bad news for that one. And then just a general reminder about ethics, and hopefully we'll have time to see how many of you were paying attention and do a little quiz there at the end. So that's what we plan to cover today. We'll start out to talk about who we are and what we do. So the Indiana Office of Inspector General was created in 2005 by executive order by then Governor Mitch Daniels. It was quickly codified into Indiana statutes, so we are now an office that is established by Indiana code. Indiana Inspector General currently is David Cook. So he is our leader in the office and heads up our team. So our four main duties are to establish the Indiana Code of Ethics. The Code of Ethics has been in existence since the 1970s, so it has been around for a very long time. However, prior to the creation of the Office of Inspector General, those Code of Ethics rules were scattered around the Indiana Code, which made it difficult oftentimes for employees to know what rules applied to them and what they needed to follow. So the first Inspector General David Thomas, two Davids, came in and put all of those code rules into one place, hopefully making it easier for all of us to know what rules were required to follow as state government employees. We also educate and advise on the Indiana Code of Ethics. So that's a big section of our office. We spend a lot of time in this. We do the online biennial ethics training every 2 years. Hopefully you all have taken that. If you've been in state government for more than 6 weeks, you should have taken that at least once. You will have to take it again this year. At the end of the year, we're going to be rolling that out again. So stay tuned for more information about that. We also provide advice. So I'll talk a little bit more about the types of advice that we offer and how you can access that advice. And then we also provide in-person training. So if you or your agency or a small group within your agency wants in-person training on a specific rule or on the code in general, we're happy to provide that. So since COVID ended, we've been hitting a lot of agencies to provide training on, again, the code in general or specific rules that might be of interest to you. So for example, if you know the transition in the administration is coming, you anticipate a lot of people leaving, you might want a specific training on the post-employment rules and how they might apply to your specific agency. So we're happy to do that. Just reach out to our office if you have an interest in that type of training. If you're familiar with the Office of Inspector General, you probably know that we also investigate allegations of wrongdoing within state government. That includes allegations of waste, fraud, abuse, and violations of both the criminal code and the code of ethics. So we do have a team of very, very experienced law enforcement agents within our office. All of them, except one, are retired state troopers, and they've each of them have 30 to 40 plus years of law enforcement experience. So we're very lucky with the team of investigators we have on staff. But what happens is anyone in the public or you all as state employees can submit a complaint to our office about wrongdoing in the executive branch of state government. Our attorneys, myself, Doreen, and Hope, and our newest attorney, Elaine, will screen those complaints and make a determination, make a recommendation to the Inspector General on whether to open a case for an investigation. If we do decide to open that investigation, an agent is assigned and he will then start gathering documents, interviewing witnesses, and doing what needs to be done to investigate that case fully. We also have the function to adjudicate wrongdoing in state government. If we find evidence of a code of ethics violation, we have the ability to take that case to the State Ethics Commission in an administrative hearing and ask that they find probable cause for an ethics complaint. If they do find probable cause, then we can take that, we can file a complaint with the Ethics Commission and take that case before them to see if they'll find a violation. So that's a big part of what we do as well. We also take criminal cases to county prosecutors. So we work in all 92 counties. So that includes your central office employees as well as employees in some of your district offices that may engage in criminal wrongdoing. So we can package those cases up. We present those cases to the prosecutor with a certification letter and probable cause affidavit. And we ask that the prosecutor file charges. And we've been successful in many of those cases that we've sent to various prosecutors across the state. So, one thing I mentioned is that's very important to our office is providing advice. We think it's really important to not just enforce the code of ethics, but to make sure people know how they can follow the code of ethics and get thorough, accurate, timely advice. So this is really an important function of our office. We want to be proactive as opposed to just simply reacting to wrongdoing. We want to prevent it before it takes place. So there's three main ways you can get ethics advice as a state employee. One of those is through your agency ethics officer. So each agency has their own ethics officer within their agency. And these folks are very familiar with their own agency policies and practices. And usually they're a lot more familiar than we are about what your role is in state government. So these are folks important to know. Who knows who their agency ethics officer is? Okay. I see most of the folks raising your hand. If you don't know who your agency ethics officer, there is a list on our website. You can click on that and you can find out who that person is. Or of course you can contact our office and we'll let you know. So they're good folks, important folks for you to know. The other two types of advice come from our office or the State Ethics Commission. And we staff the State Ethics Commission, so sometimes I use that interchangeably. The first type of advice is what we call an informal advisory opinion. These are quick, written, confidential ethics advisory opinions to people associated with state government when they have a prospective question on the code of ethics. So when I say quick, I mean quick. So we usually turn these around within 1 to 3 business days. I think our average right now is 1.5 days. So that's from the time that we get all the information we need to give you thorough advice. So you may send a question to our office and we may have some follow-up questions, but once we get the information we need, we can turn that around pretty quickly. Again, they're confidential, so our office cannot share with anyone, including your boss, including, your agency leadership, what your question is. Now, you can share it. If you're the requester of an ethics advisory opinion, you can share it with whomever you want. So it's a nice way for you to protect yourself if you have an ethics question. And I also want to note that if you follow the advice in an informal advisory opinion, it will show that you acted in good faith in accordance with the code of ethics. So it's, again, really good protection for you to have. The other type of ethics advice you can request is what's called a formal advisory opinion. Those are issued by the State Ethics Commission as opposed to the attorneys in the Office of Inspector General. They're issued at a public meeting. So that's one big difference between those two types of advice, is those are done at a public meeting where you actually present your question there to the commission at one of their monthly meetings. Now, the Ethics Commission is the ultimate authority on the code of ethics. So if you follow the advice given to you in a formal advisory opinion, it will show that it's conclusive proof that you've acted in accordance with the code of ethics. So it is the strongest evidence you could have that you were acting in accordance with the code, assuming that you told the truth and that you followed the advice that you were given. The other big difference between these two types of advice is formal advisory opinions take longer to get. So the commission meets once every month. And because we have to prepare documents in advance of those meetings, we ask that people that have a request for a formal advisory opinion submit those to our office at least 10 days prior to the commission meeting. And those requests must also be in writing and signed by the requester according to the rules. So it does take longer to get these, but again, they are that highest level of advice that you can get on the code of ethics. Two quick notes on these two types of advice. I note that they are prospective only. And what I mean by that is if you've already taken an action, if you ask for us for advice, hey, I've been working for this outside company for 2 years, can I continue to work for them? That's going to be really a tough call for us. If it's done, we're not going to provide you with retroactive advice because, quite frankly, we may already have a complaint that we're investigating involving that issue. Really, what you want to make sure is that you ask the question before you take the action that you're thinking about doing. The other thing is we try to avoid providing advice to third parties. So what I mean by that is it's got to be either personal to you, I'm thinking about taking this outside job, or if you're an ethics officer, we'll respond to the request for advice if you're the agency ethics officer. What we'll sometimes get is people that will send us a request for advice that says something like this. I noticed that the person in the cubicle next to me has this outside job and they're doing their outside job during state business hours. Is that okay? Well, that's a complaint is what that is. And we will likely process that as a complaint. So we only provide advice, again, that's personal to you, or again, if you're an agency ethics officer. All right. So just wanted to show you on our website where you can request advice. That's on that left side drop-down menu. There's a request for both informal advisory opinions and then a link to the formal advisory opinions, how you can get instructions for doing that. Right underneath that, there is a hotline link. That's where you can submit a complaint. So if you want to rat out the person in the cubicle next to you, that's where you go for that. All right. So you may know, you may not, but the Office of Inspector General is limited in our jurisdiction. So we always like to point this out just to make sure you know who we have oversight over. It's only the executive branch of Indiana state government. So that includes statewide elected officers, so governor, attorney general, secretary of state, et cetera, as well as state executive branch employees. I would imagine most of you fall under that category. And then we also have jurisdiction of special state appointees. These are your boards and commission members. So if you are in an agency that oversees a board or commission, those folks will also fall under the Indiana Code of Ethics, as well as the jurisdiction of the Office of Inspector General. So, for example, if there's a criminal complaint involving one of these folks, maybe taking a bribe or having a conflict of interest related to their state position on that board or commission, that would fall under the Office of Inspector General's jurisdiction. We have very limited jurisdiction over people with a business relationship with the state of Indiana. The Code of Ethics does not actually apply to state contractors. However, we do investigate, for example, cases of criminal wrongdoing involving contractors in their work on a state contract. So for example, a double billing case, a fraud case, those types of things. We do in fact investigate those matters. But the code of ethics itself does not apply to most state contractors. I say most because it applies for contracts for personal services. But very few, if any, contracts with the state of Indiana are for personal services. If you look at your contracts, most of those are going to be for professional services. So just something to keep in mind if you're looking at the code of ethics. I'm not saying don't send us those things. If you feel like there's something really troubling about an action that a contractor's taking, we'll be happy to take a look at it and let you know whether or not that's something we can investigate. But I do like to point out our specific jurisdiction. All right. So the Indiana Ethics Code is on our website, but you can also find it in 42 IAC or IC 426. Again, we tried to put them all in one easy to find place so you can access those rules. All right. Since this is a contracting seminar, we have to mention financial disclosure statements, because that is something all individuals with final purchasing authority are required to file. So this rule applies to a variety of individuals, including candidates for public office, certain statewide elected offices, such as the governor, lieutenant governor, et cetera. But also it applies to state actors with what the statute says calls final purchasing authority. Now that term is not defined in the statute, which makes it a little bit difficult, but the State Ethics Commission has broadly defined it in the past. So we've really looked at this as anybody who can make purchases through a variety of different methods. And that includes through your P cards or your T cards or through the state's purchasing system. So if you're somebody in your office that has that ability, this is something you will need to do on an annual basis. You need to file those disclosure statements, one, within 60 days of receiving final purchasing authority. Two, every year thereafter, and we do require that to be done. We do require that to be done in January for the previous year. So you'll likely get a notice in early January that your financial disclosure statement is due, and you'll have a month to complete that because those are due by February 1st of every year. And then again, annually thereafter. And then you have to submit it as well 30 days after leaving state government employment. So if you have, well, let me back up. Every year from the Department of Administration, we coordinate with them and they provide us with a list of those individuals that need to file a financial disclosure statement, that they either had a P card, a T card, or they had certain permissions within the system to make purchases. If you are on that list, or if you had one of those cards, you need to file regardless of whether or not you use the card. So the way the rule has been interpreted in the past is it's if you had the authority to make purchases, not whether or not you made purchases. So when you get those notices, it's a pretty easy filing process. You just fill out the information. Click the boxes, fill out whatever information you need to disclose, and then submit that to our office. Those statements are public. They are public documents. We post the ones regarding statewide elected officers as well as candidates for statewide elected officers, but we do not post those because quite frankly, there's thousands of them. So we don't post those, but I did want to make you aware that they are public documents. So it's a little bit about financial disclosure statements and just to know that that is something our office is involved with. All right. So the Code of Ethics, beyond the financial disclosure statements, hits on a lot of different topics. We're going to only cover those that we think are most relevant to you all that do contracting and that come up the most frequently. But I ask you to keep in mind that these are the minimum standards for state government employees. The goal is to promote confidence in state government and ensure integrity in state government. So the idea is these rules help deter public corruption, which can cost the state of Indiana millions of dollars and affect services, discourage investment, et cetera. So these rules are really important. As I think Tammy said earlier today, what you all do is really important. So maintaining that integrity in state government is what this is all about. So at this point, we're going to try to dig into these rules a little bit more. I'm going to turn it over to Hope to cover the gift rule.
Overview of what our office does. So today I'm gonna jump into the gift. Now, everybody loves gifts. I mean, who doesn't love a gift card, a baked good, cookies? But in our role in state government, we have to be careful when we're accepting gifts. I'm gonna go. So there's a gift rule in of ethics, and it provides that you, your spouse, and your children cannot accept or receive any of the following type of gifts. So gifts, favors, services, entertainment, food or drink, travel expenses, or registration fees. So you cannot accept any of this from a person that has a business relationship with your agency or a person who seeks to influence you in your official state capacity. So this begs the question, what is a business relationship? So a person with a business relationship with your agency is going to be someone who fits into at least one of the following three categories. So it's someone with a financial interest in a contract or purchase with your agency, like a vendor or independent contractor, someone with a license or permit in which your agency exercises judgment or discretion over, and lastly, a lobbyist. So if any of those people are trying to offer you a gift, think twice about it. And specifically, I want to highlight for you all today, obviously this is state contracting seminar, and I listed a financial interest in a contract or purchase with your agency. So as you're dealing with contracts in your role, think very hard if an independent contractor or a vendor is offering you something. Just think twice about that. I'd also like to mention that the gifts rule prohibits gifts with people with a business relationship, and it also prohibits people that are seeking to influence you in your state capacity from offering you a gift. So it doesn't matter whether the person providing the gift actually influenced you. The gift rule aims to just avoid the perception that they're going to influence you. So fraud, as you can see. And lastly, the gift rule also provides that you cannot solicit gifts for these same entities. So you cannot solicit gifts for yourself or on behalf of anyone, for like a charity, for example, from persons that have a business relationship with, or from persons who seek to influence. That's kind of the general gist of the gift rule. But there are some exceptions. So, practically speaking, there's some times when accepting a gift is okay. There's 8 exceptions to the gifts rule. I'm just going to go into some of the most common exceptions we see. So mementos and souvenirs of nominal value. This is like a pin or keychain received during a seminar, a training, a conference, such as this. Those, a pin like this, don't worry about it. It's so small. We're not going to open a case about that. Take all the pins and keychains you want at these events. Don't worry about us. The next one is a gift from a relative or person you have an ongoing social relationship. This exception applies so long as the gift is not offered to influence you and the gift giver does not deduct the gift as a business expense. So, whenever you're celebrating your birthday or Christmas and your friends and family gives you gifts, we're not knocking down your door then either. Have a happy birthday, Merry Christmas, and don't worry about us in this context. Additionally, along with these 8 exceptions, you can get a gift waiver by your agency's appointing authority at their discretion. So the reason you would want a gift waiver is, want to receive this gift, but it doesn't fall into any of the exceptions. You can go to your appointing authority and see if they'll waive the gift. The biggest thing with the gift waiver, is that the gift has to be consistent. You want to go to a conference and get your registration fees paid, or food or drink at a training. Those are common things we see people have received. But again, the key requirement with the gift waiver is it consistent? And it is important to note that gift waivers are public. So they are filed with the State Ethics Commission and they are posted on our website. So just think about, is this a gift that I want everyone to know about? Because with the waiver, they will know. And in general, just as a good guidepost, just be mindful of this rule and any perceptions that the acceptance of the gift will cause, such as like undue influence or something like that. And if you have any questions, and we'll try to harp on this, but just go to your ethics officer and ask us. We are here to help you with all of your gift questions and anything like that. Are complicated. It took me a couple months to even figure them out. All right, so next we're gonna hand it off to Doreen to talk to you about conflicts.
Thank you, Hope, for providing that information and the overview of the gifts rule. And again, I wanted to thank the audience for joining us today to talk about ethics. My name is Doreen Clark. I'm one of the staff attorneys for the Indiana Office of Inspector General. And for my portion of the presentation today, I'm going to be talking about conflicts of interest. 2 of the conflicts of interest rules I'm going to be talking about are under the Code of Ethics. So that would be the So that would be the conflicts of interest related to contracts, and then the conflicts of interest related to decisions and votes. Then I'm going to talk about the criminal conflicts of interest, which is not under the Code of Ethics. That's actually under the Criminal Code under Title 35. I have a few goals in mind when talking to you about these conflicts of interest rules today. First, I want to give you an overview, a general understanding of what these rules are about. I want to talk about how they apply to state employees, the exceptions to the rules, and then the potential consequences of violating these rules today. So with that being said, let me go ahead and talk about the conflicts of interest related to contracts. This rule can be found under 4-2-6-10.5. I just call it Rule 10.5. And it prohibits a state employee from knowingly obtaining a financial interest in a contract with any agency. So not just your agency, basically any agency. The code essentially defines a financial interest as any purchase, sale, lease, contract, option, or other transaction between an agency or any person or involving property or services. So you mostly see this issue come up when you have somebody who is seeking outside employment or a second job. Oftentimes, when this issue comes up, the second job that they're seeking, that employer has some kind of state contract with any of these agencies, could be FSSA or any of those types of agencies. And the compensation that they're going to receive is going to be derived from that state contract between that employer and that state agency. And 10.5 seeks to avoid that situation entirely. Now, there is an exception to this rule in which a state employee can actually have a financial interest in a state contract, but they have to meet 2 factors. First, the state employee basically cannot have any contracting responsibilities in their day-to-day duties. So whatever they're doing as a state employee, they can't be dealing with contracts whatsoever. That's very easy to meet for most people. The second factor, however, is that the state employee must file a written disclosure form with our office prior to the execution of a contract with that state agency. So this, for a lot of people, this second exception provides a challenge, and it makes it hard for people to meet this exception, because most often what you will see is that you'll see a situation in which the state employee wants to work with a vendor who has an existing contract already with that state agency, and the compensation is going to come from that state agency. But because that state employee was not there to file that written disclosure form with our office prior to the execution of that contract, they couldn't take the job. And this issue has come before the SEC, that's the State Ethics Commission, many, many times. And they have remained very strict on this. They've basically said that state employees cannot accept the compensation derived from a state contract from the vendor where the contract was already established, and the employee did not file a written disclosure form prior to the execution of the contract with the state agency. So even though, again, that state employee had nothing to do with contracts, because they weren't there to file that written disclosure form prior to the execution of that contract, and that contracts already exist, they can't take that job. Okay, so I'll provide an example so that it makes it easier to understand. So let's say that you're a DCS worker, and in your DCS job, you don't have any contracting responsibilities whatsoever. And then you decide to take a second job with an employer who has an existing contract with FSSA. In this case, you will not be able to take the job with that employer if your compensation is derived from that contract between the employer and FSSA. Because despite the fact that you do not have any contracting responsibilities with DCS, because you did not file that disclosure form with our office prior to the establishment of the contract between that employer and FSSA, under this rule, you would not have met that exception under 10.5. This is a clearer example. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I'm going to provide a summary of what this basically says. So it says that you have a BMV employee who is seeking an additional job to supplement their income. The BMV employee has offered to work a second job as a caseworker for ABC Health. ABC Health has a pre-existing contract with FSSA, which was established prior to the employee being hired at BMV. Additionally, if the BMV employee accepts the job as a caseworker, his salary will be derived using funds from that FSSA contract. In this case, it would not be acceptable for the BMV employee to take the caseworker position, because ABC Health will be paying the BMV employee using funds from that state contract. Also, because the contract has already existed and a disclosure form was not filed by that BMV employee prior to the establishment of the contract between ABC Health and FSSA, accepting this position as a caseworker in this case would be in violation of 10.5. Now, there are a few ways to check if there is a state contract if you're seeking a second job. One of the ways is to search through the Indiana Transparency Portal for a state contract. Now, if you do search through that Indiana Transparency Portal and you do find a state contract and you're interested in working for a vendor or something like that, then more guidance will be needed at this point. You can either contact your agency's ethics officer, or you could seek our office for advice through an informal advisory opinion. And this is a screenshot of that Indiana Transparency Portal where you can search for any state contracts. So now let's go ahead and talk about conflicts of interest related to decision and votes. This is under Indiana Code 4-2-6-9. And this rule prohibits a state employee from participating in any decision or vote or matter related to a decision or vote if the employee has knowledge that various persons may have a financial interest in the outcome of the matter. So what triggers this what financial interest triggers this prohibition? This would be state employees, such as if a state employee has a personal business, an immediate family member, a business organization in which the state employee is serving as an officer, director, member, trustee, partner, or employee, and an organization with whom the state employee is negotiating or has an arrangement concerning prospective employment. So what does an example of 4269, what would that look like? So let's say that you have an FSSA employee who has a second job working for ABC Health. As part of the FSSA's employee state duties, the FSSA employee is charged with making decisions or votes that can affect whether certain companies can receive funds, grants or funds. If the FSSA employee intentionally decides to provide funds to ABC Health because she feels that she can use her position to help the company, or that ABC Health feels as though they could benefit from her services as a state employee to receive those funds, then you have a decisions and votes issue. Now, if a state employee does recognize that there is this 4269 issue, you cannot just simply step back or recuse yourself from the matter. You would have to take some active steps to entirely avoid this situation. So the first thing, there are two things you could do. The first thing you can do is to seek an advisory opinion from the State Ethics Commission. In this case, the commission will assign the particular matter to another person and implement the necessary procedures to screen the employee seeking an advisory opinion from involvement in the matter. Or the SEC can make a written determination that the interest is not so substantial that the commission considers it to likely affect the integrity of the services that the state expects from the employee. The second option that the state employee has is to file a written disclosure form with our office. Now, if the state employee decides to take this direction, there's some information that they will need to include into this form. The first is they'll need to include details of the conflicts of interest, a description that affirms the implementation of the screen, and the state employee's and ethics officer's signature. The form needs to be filed no later than 7 days after the conduct gives rise to the conflict. And then this slide shows how you can file that disclosure form with our office if you recognize this decision and votes issue. The last thing I want to talk to you about is the criminal conflicts of interest. And as mentioned before, this is under Title 35. It's a criminal statute that prohibits certain public servants from having a pecuniary interest in or deriving profit from a contract with the public servants agency. So an example in this case would be if you have an NDOT employee who has a side job developing software for various companies and decides to contract within his own agency, NDOT, to sell that software, this would trigger a violation under this rule. Now, people who do decide to participate in this type of activity, and if we do investigate it and decide to take it to a prosecutor, and the prosecutor decides to file charges, this would be considered a level 6 felony. So it is very important to keep mindful when engaging with an outside employer or within your own agency with these type of issues here. So with that being said, I'm going to turn over the next portion of the presentation to Hope. She's going to talk to you about post-employment matters.
Thank you so much, Doreen, with that insight into all the different conflicts of interest that can develop. So, post-employment, also known as your life after state government. Our goal, we hope you enjoy your work at the state and you're here a long while. But I'd like to provide you with things you have to keep in mind should you seek work after state employment. So to give you a brief overview of the post-employment rule, it's similar to a non-compete in the private sector. The gist of the rule is that there are two main restrictions that apply to state employees, such as all of us likely, when we leave state employment and want to work for a new employer. So the first one, as you can see on the slide, is the cooling off restriction. This lists different employees for whom you are prohibited from working, for accepting employment for 1 whole year after leaving work with the state government because of certain things you worked on while at the state. The second main restriction is the particular matter restriction. And this prohibits you from ever working on any of the 12 listed particular matters for any new employer when you leave state government. So diving deeper into these two restrictions. First, the cooling off restriction. So you must wait a full year, 365 days after working your last day at the state to start working for a new employer if you're going to do any of the following. So if you're going to lobby after the state, you have to wait a year. If you negotiated or administered a contract involving your prospective employer, you have to wait a year. And if you made regulatory or licensing decisions involving your prospective employer, you again have to wait a year before you can work with that employer. Moving on to the particular matter restriction again. So in general, with your new employer, you cannot work on any of the same particular matter that you were working on as a state employee with any of the 12 particular matters that I'll list later. But you can do the following with a new employer. You can work on any new particular matter or matters that you did not work on as a state employee. You just can't do the same, like if you're working on the same contract, let's say it's a contract between NDOT and your prospective employer. If you do that in your state role and you want to work for that new employer, you cannot work on that contract because it's the same. But if there's a different contract, a new one, you can, if that makes sense. So going into each of the 3 restrictions of the cooling off period. So 1 year after state employment, like I said, you cannot serve as a lobbyist. However, this is actually a very narrow rule. So you can't be a lobbyist only for the executive branch of Indiana state government. So this doesn't prevent you, surprisingly, from legislative lobbying. So you can do that without waiting 1 year, but you have to wait 1 year to be an executive branch lobbyist. Next, and this is particularly important for everyone here today, I would guess, is if state duties negotiate contract with your new employer for and you have discretionary decision-making affecting that contract, you must again wait 1 year before you can start employment with that employer. But to caution you, this is a very fact-sensitive determination, negotiating and administering, and it really just depends on what exactly you're doing that contract. If you meet this and it is broadly interpreted by the State Ethics Commission. So when in doubt, ask us and ask your ethics officer because they usually find, or at least broadly find, that you negotiate. And third, diving a little deeper into regulatory and licensing decisions. So you must wait 1 year from working with a new employer if you made regulatory or licensing decisions with that employer. Additional restriction with the cooling off period is we're also prohibited from accepting employment for 1 year if the circumstances surrounding your hire suggest that the employer's purpose is to influence you in your official capacity as a state employee. That's kind of what I talked about earlier with the gifts rule. Just think about, how does this look? Does it look like they're influencing me? Even if they're not, if it looks like it, you should be very. Okay, so these are the 12 different particular matters that you cannot work on for your new employer that I referenced earlier. This restriction, though, is limited and it only applies to these 12 matters. So if you did something for the state that isn't one of these 12 things and you want to do it for your new employer, you likely can. The key test here to determine whether you're restricted from working on these particular matters with your new employer is the personal and substantial test. So in order to be prohibited from working on these matters, you have to have been personally and substantially involved in the matter as a state employee. And only the State Ethics Commission can determine whether you were in fact personally and substantially involved in this way. And just something to keep in mind is this restriction is for the life of the matter. So you will never be able to work on that state contract that you did in your state role for your new employer. And this is different from the cooling off period that only applies for 1 year. So eventually, if you wait 1 year, you can work for the new employer. But particular matter, it is forever. Now, just want to note again, you are not restricted though from any new matter. So the next thing I want to get into is post-employment waivers. So there's gift waivers, as I talked about earlier, and there's also post-employment waivers. Why would you want a waiver? So you may want a waiver of the if the post-employment rule prohibits you from working for your new employer, but you still want to. This is an option for you. So there are some requirements to get this waiver, and you must make sure you follow them exactly. But if you do, this is a good option for us all as state employees. So the first step is you want to talk to your agency's ethics officer and get their help with drafting a waiver. And additionally, you need to get the signature of the appointing authority at your agency and the agency ethics officer. And something important to note is some appointing authorities grant these waivers and some do not. It is entirely the discretion of the appointing authority at your agency whether you get this waiver or not. It's not our decision at our office or anybody else. So you first got to make sure your appointing authority. As you can see, there's a couple additional requirements at number 2 that you want to put in the waiver, but I specifically want to highlight D. And this is, will the waiver be consistent with public interest? And this is arguably the most important element. So, why would the public benefit from you getting this waiver? Ask yourself and explain. So a good tip is if you are considering leaving state government and you need to get a waiver, I'd recommend doing it as soon as possible. The time frame can vary a lot, but it really depends on how fast your agency and the State Ethics Commission review, hopefully agree to your waiver. But the State Ethics Commission only meets once per month, so that is a limitation in that regard. And next, I'm going to pass it off to Tiffany to tell you what happens if sadly we find an ethics violation.
Here. So I hope from Doreen and Hope's comments so far, you've kind of come to the understanding that these ethics rules are not always easy to interpret, and they can be complicated and they're incredibly fact sensitive. I've been with the office for a long time now, and different groups of attorneys will get a question that'll come across our desk, and gosh, we really also are scratching our heads. We have to all get into the office and discuss them. People think ethics questions are easy. Not the case with the State Code of Ethics. I wish sometimes it were easier, but I say that only to highlight the fact that, look, if you have a question, ask. You're not alone. We are here to help walk you through that. And where we can't help you, we'll help you through the process of going to the State Ethics Commission. However, we also have an enforcement function in our office. As I mentioned, we have special agents that investigate allegations of wrongdoing. When we find evidence of a code of ethics violation, we will bring that to the State Ethics Commission within the discretion of the Inspector General. The Ethics Commission has a variety of penalties listed to it through state statute that they can assess. And, you know, that there's a lengthy list there, no? Now there is. There's a lengthy list of what the State Ethics Commission can assess. The two most common ones are a civil penalty of up to 3 times the benefit received. That's the one we see most commonly with the State Ethics Commission. The other is debarment from future state employment, and we've seen them issue that from time to time as well. There's also, you know, reprimands, suspension, termination, as well as restitution. But the big ones are the civil penalty as well as the debarment. Just to note, the most recent case we had that went to the State Ethics Commission, it was Hope's case. The individual went to go work for a company she had regulated as a state employee. So she had done the inspection and the recommendation, and then within, I think it was a matter of weeks, rather than waiting the cooling off period, the 1-year period that Hope talked about, she went immediately and worked for that entity. That case, the commission found probable cause for violation of the code's post-employment rule. And we filed a complaint and ended up settling that case. The fine in that case was $10,000. So these fines can get pricey in certain cases. And it could have gone much higher. That was actually, again, a settlement. We negotiated that. They could have gone much higher in that penalty. So I always like to, well, I don't like to, because I don't like to talk about penalties, but I always want to make sure folks know that there are real penalties associated with these violations. The other thing to keep in mind is, you know, media, the public, they pay attention to ethics issues. They don't like it when they see wrongdoing in state government. And this can be embarrassing for the people involved. You know, we have seen our cases covered in the news from time to time. So, you know, if it's something that you would be embarrassed to have splashed over the front page of the paper, don't do it, or at least ask. And we can, again, guide you on whether there's a way to do what you want to do in a way that's transparent and follows all of the ethical requirements. Also, sometimes we see, even when somebody strictly follows the code of ethics, technically complies, if there's an appearance issue, the media likes to report on that as well. So we're public servants, you know, appearance matters as well as technical compliance with the rules. All right. Also, for the attorneys in the room, I want to do a quick note about the rules of professional conduct. If you don't know this already, the Supreme Court Disciplinary Commission does provide advisory opinions on the rules of professional conduct, and we've included a link here on the slide. And you know, they have issued some opinions specific to government employees. We have one there as well. Our office does not have jurisdiction over the rules of professional conduct or compliance with those rules. But this is a CLE. We know there's attorneys in the room, so we wanted to highlight this as well. All right, before we've only got about 5 minutes. I just want to ask, are there any burning questions? Now we'll ask you some questions. Seeing none, we'll just do a couple of these just for fun. Do you want to do the first one, Hope?
Okay, so yeah, we got a fun little quiz to break things up. I know we're between you guys and lunch, so try to make this fast. So the first question we have for you to all think about is, a contractor at your agency has offered you a free registration for a conference. Can you accept the free registration? So I'll give you guys seconds or so to think about this. Hard. Okay, so the correct answer, I hope you all got, is C. No, your agency has a business relationship with the contractor. So unless an exception applies or you get a waiver, you cannot accept this. Here, a business relationship clearly exists in this situation. There is a business relationship because the contractor at your agency is a person with whom a person who has a pecuniary interest in a contract or purchase with your agency as a contractor. I mean, there's obviously a contract there. Keep in mind the spirit of the rules as we talked about specific provisions under the code. Even if you could accept a gift under the gifts rule, you may want to consider the optics and the appearance, as we've talked about. I'm gonna go straight to 3, Doreen, if that's okay, just to.
So we're going to go ahead and go to question number 3. I'm going to go ahead and read it. Can you take an outside job with a nonprofit organization that has a grant with another state agency? And I'll give you guys some time. All right, so hopefully you guys chose letter D because that's what the answer is. So we discussed this earlier under, this is a 10.5 issue. If you do not work for the granting agency, you are still prohibited from deriving funds from any state contract. However, if you do not have contracting authority for the granting agency and you file a disclosure statement before the contract is executed, then you can accept the compensation from the outside employment.
Gonna skip ahead again because we got 1 minute. I'll go to the last one because it's my favorite. So you have a question regarding the code of ethics that and what you can do. Let me start over. You have a question regarding the code of ethics and whether it would allow you to accept a job you are considering. What should you do? What does everybody think? Nobody's watching. Take the job. Take the job. There's no real penalties. Ask for advice from your ethics officer, our office, or the State Ethics Commission, or stress out about it for days and lose sleep, which is what some people do. So hopefully you got C. The answer is C. So with that, we appreciate everybody's attention today. And again, appreciate the Attorney General's office. There's our contact information if you would like to reach out.
All right, thank you to the Office of Inspector General, and really thank you to all the agencies, my staff at the OAG, as well as IDOA, IoT, and SBA for taking the time to present here as well today. So much appreciated. A couple housekeeping items before we depart for the day. First and foremost, make sure as an attorney, if you're claiming CLE, you turn in your form at the registration desk on your way out. For those attending virtually, we do ask that you submit your form within 30 days of this presentation so that we can get those submitted on your behalf. Final point, we packed a lot of information in here today. Just know a copy of the final PowerPoint slides that were presented here, they will be available on the IDOA contracts page, as well as a copy or a link to the presentation itself. So with that, thank you for your attendance and your attention. We appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.